There is a kind of road that only wakes at night, when the traffic has thinned to nothing and the towns have put out their lights, and the dark lies down flat across the country and waits. Most of them are harmless, but there is one road across one more, as a man I know learned in a single winter, where something is still driving toward a hospital it will never reach, and at 2 in the morning it comes looking for a living crew to help it finish. Good evening. Come and sit down before we go out onto that moor, because this is a story that keeps late hours, and it is better told with the kettle on and the door shut against the cold. I'm the one who tells these tales. I gather the ones that people carry quietly for half their lives, the ones they will only give you at the end of a long night when their guard is finally down, and I sit with them until they settle into something I can pass to you. Tonight's story came to me from a man who spent one winter driving a night ambulance out of a small station on the edge of a great empty moor, and who, after that winter, never worked another night shift in his life. So pull your chair in close, and let me tell you about a road, a fog, and an ambulance that would not stop answering. The man at the heart of it had come to the work the way a lot of men come to night work, because he was good in the small hours, and because he had run out of better offers. He had driven long-distance lorries for years, up and down the country in the dark, and he was easy with empty roads and with his own company for hours at a stretch. When the ambulance service took him on as a night driver at a rural station out past the moor, he thought privately that it was the softest posting he had ever been given. He would come to understand, before that winter was over, that some roads run empty for a reason, and that being the only living thing on them is not at all the same as being alone. The station was a low brick building on the edge of a market town called Marsh End, which was the last town before the moor swallowed the map. Beyond it, the houses simply stopped, and the land opened out into miles of dead heather and bog and standing water, gray in the day and black at night, with the one road running straight across the middle of it toward the county hospital 40 minutes off on the far side. They called it the Barrow Road, after the old burial mounds that humped up out of the heather here and there, older than anything with a name. And there was one stretch of it, a long flat run below a rise they called Gallows Hill, that the drivers spoke of separately from the rest, and always a little more carefully. They called it the 9-mile straight. On his first night, the driver he was taking over from stayed on an hour past the end of his own shift to show him the ropes, and the man was in no hurry to leave, the way people are in no hurry to leave a thing they are glad to be rid of. He walked him through the radio and the vehicle checks and the run out to the hospital, and then, at the door with his coat already on, he told him the one thing that was not written in any of the folders. Put into my own words, it was this: do your job and do it well and keep your wheels turning toward the hospital whatever happens. But if ever you are out on the 9-mile straight at 2 in the morning in the fog, and you take a call you cannot account for, or you meet another ambulance out there coming the other way with its blue light turning, you are not to stop for it. You are not to follow it. You are not to answer it on the radio, whatever it asks of you. You let it pass, and you keep going, and you say nothing of it to control. The new driver took that for exactly what it sounded like, the sort of tale that grows up around any black spot on any lonely road, handed down from one tired man to the next like a bad penny. He thanked him, and he watched the old driver's tail lights go off toward the town, and he made himself a mug of tea in the empty station, and settled into his first night with the radio muttering low and the more pressing black against the windows. And for the first few nights it was everything he had hoped. The calls were few and ordinary: an old man short of breath, a fall, a girl with a broken wrist from a late drive home. He learned the Barrow Road in the dark until he could have driven it with his eyes shut, learned the dip and the rise of it, and the way the 9-mile straight ran flat and true below Gallows Hill with nothing on either side but the dark and the wet. There was never anything out there. That much was still true those first few nights. It would not stay true for long. The fog came in on his 6th or 7th night, and it came the way fog comes on that moor, not rolling in off the sea in a wall, but rising up out of the wet ground itself, so that the road was clear at midnight, and by 1 in the morning the whole moor had turned to a gray nothing pressed against the glass, and his headlights lit only a few yards of streaming wet tarmac before they gave up. He slowed to a crawl and drove by the cat's eyes in the road, and told himself it was only weather, and settled deeper into the quiet. It was somewhere close to 2 in the morning that the radio first did the thing that would come to trouble his sleep for years. He had the set turned low, the way you do on a slow night, just enough to catch control if a call came in. And out of the soft hiss of it a voice came up, a man's voice, calm and clipped and entirely professional, the voice of someone doing a job he had done 10,000 times. It was not talking to him. It was calling control, giving a call sign and a message, the way any crew reports in from the road. The message, put plainly, was that they were on the Barrow Road, inbound, with one patient aboard in a serious way, and would control be so good as to have the hospital stand ready to receive them. Nothing strange in the words at all. It was the most ordinary thing in the world to hear on that channel. Except that the call sign the voice gave was Marsh End 7, and the driver knew, because he had been shown the whole small fleet on his first day, that there was no Vehicle 7 at Marsh End. There were 3 ambulances at that station, and his was the newest, and the highest number on any of them was 4. He waited for Control to answer. Control did not answer. The dispatcher that night was a steady woman he had come to like, and she said nothing at all, as though she had heard nothing, and after a moment the voice came again, patient and unhurried, giving the same call sign and the same message, asking again for the hospital to stand ready. And again the airwaves gave back only the hiss of the fog. He sat with his mug going cold in his hand, and listened to a crew that did not exist ask, for the 3rd time, for a road home that no one would grant them. He keyed his own radio then, feeling foolish, and asked Control quietly whether she was getting the traffic on the channel, whether there was another vehicle out on the Barrow Road tonight that he ought to know about. There was a long pause on the line, longer than a tired dispatcher on a slow night ought to need. And then she came back, and her voice had changed, gone careful and flat, and she told him only that there was nothing else out tonight, that he was the only vehicle on the board, and that he should mind the road in this fog and pay no attention to anything else on the channel. She did not ask him what he had heard. That was the part that stayed with him. She did not ask because she already knew. The voice came twice more before the fog began to thin toward morning, always the same, always calm, always Marsh End 7 inbound with one aboard, asking for the hospital to stand ready. And each time it came he found himself listening not with fear at first but with a kind of pull, an old instinct from a life of driving, that wanted to key the radio and tell the poor devil that he heard him, that his message was received, that someone was listening after all. He did not do it. Some cold good sense held his hand back from the set each time, though he could not have told you what it was afraid of. It is a strange thing, to sit alone in the dark and refuse to answer a man who is only asking to be heard, and stranger still to feel, the longer you refuse, that the refusing is the one thing keeping you safe. When the day driver came on at last, gray light seeping across the moor and the fog going to rags in the ditches, the new man said nothing about the radio. But he checked the old duty board in the back office before he drove home, ran his finger down the list of vehicles and their numbers, and found what he already knew he would find. There was no 7. There had not been a 7 at Marsh End for a very long time. And yet all night, out in the fog on the Barrow Road, a calm and careful man had gone on calling it, over and over, asking to be let in, and something at the station, and something in that steady dispatcher's voice, had known him well enough to be afraid. It was 3 nights later, with the fog down again as thick as ever, that a real call finally sent him out onto the Barrow Road in the dead middle of the night. An elderly woman on a farm on the far side of the moor had taken a bad turn, and Control put him on the road a little before 2 in the morning, and he went out into the gray with his blue light turning, and lighting nothing but the fog around him, feeling his way along the cat's eyes at a crawl. He was out on the 9-mile straight, below the black hump of Gallows Hill somewhere off in the murk, when he saw the light ahead of him. It was another blue light, turning, low and soft in the fog perhaps a quarter of a mile on. His first thought was simple relief. Another crew, another living soul out here, someone he could raise on the radio and follow in. And then he remembered the old driver at the door with his coat on, and the rule, and the cold way the dispatcher had told him to pay no attention, and the relief in him turned over slowly into something else. He came down almost to walking pace, and out of the fog, drawn up on the verge of the 9-mile straight with its back doors standing open to the night, was an ambulance. It was an old one, he knew engines and bodywork, and this was a make that had not run on any English road in 20 years or more, boxy and high, and painted in a livery the service had long since given up. Its light turned on the roof. And in the wash of it, working at the open back of the vehicle with a stretcher half in and half out, were two men in the uniform of that older time. He slowed almost to a stop as he drew level, though every part of the rule was telling him not to, because a man cannot help but look. The two of them were entirely intent on their work, the way a good crew is, heads down, moving with the quick-sure economy of men who have done this 1,000 times and mean to lose no second of it. They did not look up at him. They did not seem to feel the cold, though the one nearest him was soaked through, his old uniform dark and heavy with water that ran off him steadily onto the road, as though he had climbed up out of the black bog itself and gone straight back to his work without minding it. On the stretcher between them, under a red blanket, was the small, still shape of a patient. And over all of it hung a silence so complete that he realized he could not hear their engine, nor their boots, nor the stretcher's wheels, nothing at all but his own idling motor and the drip of the fog. He did not stop. Whatever held his foot down, some deep animal wisdom below thought, kept the vehicle rolling, and he went on past them at a crawl into the gray, his heart going hard against his ribs. He kept his eyes on the road ahead and would not let himself look again into the mirror, though every nerve in him wanted to, and it took a strength he did not know he had to keep from slowing, from stopping, from doing the plain human thing, and going back to lend a stranded crew a hand. In his mirror, when at last he could not help but glance, the blue light turned once more, and then the fog closed over it, and it was gone. He drove the rest of the way to the farm shaking, and he did his job there. The woman was frightened and breathless and very much alive, and the ordinary work of caring for her steadied him more than anything could have. He carried her out to the ambulance and settled her and turned back for the county hospital, and he took the long way round by the coast road rather than go back down the 9-mile straight, and he told himself, the whole way, that he had seen a stranded crew and nothing more, and that it was only the fog and the hour that had made ghosts of two working men. But when he brought the old woman in through the doors of the county hospital, warm and safe, and complaining about the fuss, the night sister who took her from him mentioned, only in passing, that they had been oddly busy with the moor tonight, that not an hour before, the radio had been carrying some poor crew out on the Barrow Road calling in that they were inbound with one aboard in a serious way, asking the hospital to stand ready. She had gone down herself to open the doors for them. And she said, with a small puzzled laugh that did not quite come off, that she had stood at those open doors in the cold for a good 20 minutes, watching the fog, and that no ambulance had ever come. He could not let it lie after that, and I don't suppose any of us could have. The next day, instead of sleeping, he went looking for the one man he thought might tell him the truth of it, an old fellow who had run the radio desk at Marsh End for 30 years and more, long retired now, living out his days in a cottage on the edge of the town. The driver took him a bottle by way of an introduction, and sat with him by his fire, and asked him plainly about Marsh End 7. And the old dispatcher went very quiet and looked into his fire a long while, and then he told him the whole of it. Put into my own words and softened where it needs to be, this is the story he told. Many years before, the old man could have given the exact date, and did There had been a Vehicle 7 at Marsh End, and a crew who ran it on the night shift, two of the best men the station ever had. A driver and an attendant, both of them steady, both of them the kind who never once left a job half done. On a night of fog as thick as any the old man had seen in his life, a call had come in from a farm away out on the moor, a young boy, the farmer's son, burning up with a fever that had turned bad and frightening in the space of an evening. Vehicle 7 had taken the call. They had gone out across the moor and reached the farm and taken the boy up, and his mother with him, and they had turned for the county hospital with the child in a serious way and the whole moor lost in fog, and they had called it in, calm as anything, the way that crew always did inbound, one aboard, have the hospital stand ready. They never reached the hospital. Somewhere out on the 9-mile straight below Gallows Hill, in fog that no headlight could cut, they had gone off the road. The old man did not dwell on the how of it, and I will not either, for it does no one any good. What mattered, he said, was this, that all of them were lost that night, the driver and the attendant both, and the boy they were carrying, and that the child was never delivered to the doors that were standing open for him. The run was never completed. And on the great paper log at the station, in the book where every call was written down when it came in and struck through only when the vehicle reported the patient safely delivered, and the job done, that one call, the call from the farm on the foggy night, was never struck through. It was never cleared. There had been no one left to report it finished, and so it had simply stayed there on the book, open, an errand still owed, year after year after year. And ever since, the old man told him, on the nights when the fog came down thick over the moor, at the same dead hour the crash had happened, Vehicle 7 came back to the 9-mile straight and tried again. The same calm crew, still soaked from the black water they went down into, still working over the same small patient with the same quick devotion, still calling it in over the radio, inbound, one aboard, have the hospital stand ready and still, every time, never arriving. They were not out there to fright anyone, the old man said, and this was the thing he most wanted the driver to understand. They were not haunting the road. They were still on the job. They were two good men who had died in the middle of carrying a sick child to safety, and who did not know or would not accept that the run was over, and so they drove it and drove it and drove it, forever trying to finish the one call they had never been allowed to close. That was where the rule came from, the old man said, because more than one driver over the years had heard them calling and had answered, had keyed the radio out of pity, or had stopped on the 9-mile to help, or had turned and followed that blue light into the fog. And it was a dangerous thing to do, because Vehicle 7 was looking always for a crew to help them finish the run at last. And a living man who answered them, who joined them, who took up their unfinished errand as though it were his own, that man risked being taken into the run with them, to drive it forever too. The old dispatcher looked at him very steadily then, and told him that the only safe thing, the thing he had told every new driver for 30 years, was never to answer. Keep your own wheels turning toward your own hospital and let the dead crew call. He said it plainly. And then he said, more quietly, that he had never once been easy in his conscience about it, because it had always seemed to him a hard thing to leave two good men calling in the fog forever, and never once tell them that they were heard. The worst night of that winter came near the end of it, and the driver knew it would be a bad one from the moment he came on shift, because the fog was already down before dark, thicker than he had seen it yet, so that the lights of Marsh End were smeared and small behind him before he had driven 100 yards, and the moor beyond was simply gone. The call came a little before 2 in the morning, and it came from the same farm out on the far side of the moor, a coincidence, or perhaps not, but the same lonely farm the old woman had called from, someone taken ill again in the small hours. Control put him on the road. He sat a moment in the yard before he pulled out, the engine idling, watching the fog crawl in the wash of his headlights, and he thought about turning the job down, about telling them he could not see to drive it, and he knew even as he thought it that he would not. There was someone out there who needed carrying in. That was the whole of the work, and it did not stop being the work because he was afraid. So he went out onto the Barrow Road into a fog so total that the world had shrunk to the small, lit sphere of his own cab, and he felt his way out toward the 9-mile straight with his heart already going, because he knew, the way you know a storm is coming, what was waiting for him out there tonight. Every cat's eye in the road came up slow out of the gray and slid away under him, one after another, the only proof that the road was still there at all. And the further out he went, the more the silence pressed in, until it seemed to him that the whole moor was holding its breath and waiting to see what he would do. The radio woke as he came onto the straight, but this time it did not call control. This time, out of the hiss, the calm, clipped voice of the crew that had been dead for 20 years spoke his own call sign, Marsh N2, and asked him, driver to driver, in the plain, tired language of men who share a hard trade, whether he would help them. They had won aboard in a serious way, the voice said. They had been trying such a long time to bring him in. The fog was very bad, and the road was very long, and they were so nearly there, and they only needed a hand to help them carry him the last of the way. Would he not come, the voice asked him, and lend them a hand, and help them finish the run? And out of the gray ahead of him, the blue light bloomed, and there they were, the old high ambulance drawn up on the verge with its back doors open, and the two soaked men turning now to look at him for the first time, their faces tired and kind and terribly hopeful, and between them on the stretcher the small still shape under the red blanket. And as he came level and slowed, the nearest of them stepped back and set his wet hand on the door of the ambulance and drew it open, so that there was a place inside, a seat beside them in the warm lit box of it, plainly meant for him. All he had to do was stop and step across and take it up. All he had to do was say that he would help. And God forgive him, he told me, but he wanted to. He wanted to more than he had wanted anything in a long gray life of empty roads, because it was not a trick and it was not a threat. It was the oldest, plainest, most decent thing in the world that they were asking of him, one working man to another, and everything in him that had ever carried a frightened stranger through the dark leaned toward that open door and that empty seat. They only wanted help. He had spent his whole life answering exactly this, a voice in the dark, a stranger in trouble, a hand held out that needed taking, and every instinct that had made him good at the work was suddenly turned against him, because every one of them was telling him to stop the van and go to them. The child had waited so long. It would be so easy and so kind and so right to stop the van and step across and put his shoulder to their burden and help them carry it home at last. His foot came off the accelerator. His hand went to the door of his own cab. Out on the verge the two men waited, soaked and patient and hoping, holding the door of the run open for him, and the small shape under the blanket waited too, and the fog closed the whole world down to that one lit box, and the seat inside it that had been kept, all these years, for a living man kind enough to climb aboard. What stopped him in the end was the old dispatcher's face by the fire, and the one thing he had said that the driver had not been able to forget, that a living man who took up the run as though it were his own would be taken into it forever, to drive it without end. And he understood, with his hand on the door and that warm seat waiting, what the trap of it truly was. To climb across into their ambulance was not to help them finish the run. It was to join a run that could never finish, to become a third soaked man calling forever in the fog, holding the door open in his turn for the next kind fool who came along. Their kindness had drowned them. It would drown him too. The seat beside them was not a way to end their long errand. It was only a way to share it. But he saw in the same moment the other thing, the thing the old man had grieved over by his fire, that these were not monsters to be fled from, but two good men who had never been told that they were heard, and a child who had never been brought in from the cold, and a call that had sat open on a book for 20 years because no living hand had ever closed it. And it came to him that there was a way to help them that was not the seat beside them. He could not carry their burden by joining them, but he could carry it the way the living carry things for the dead, by finishing, in the world of the warm and the breathing, the run that they could not. So he did not stop, and he did not take the seat. Instead, he keyed his own radio, and in a steady voice, driver to driver, across whatever gulf it was that lay between them, he told the crew of Vehicle 7 that he had received their message, that it was heard, that they had carried their patient bravely and far and had not failed him, and that they could stand down now because he had the run from here. And then he pulled ahead of them on the 9-mile straight, and he put his blue light on, and he drove not away from them, but before them, leading, the way the newest vehicle leads a convoy home, the whole long, foggy length of the barrow road to the doors of the county hospital, with the old high ambulance following soft and silent in his mirror the whole way, its blue light turning, keeping station behind him like a crew that has at last been given the road. He came down off the moor and in through the gates and drew up at the lit doors of the hospital where, 20 years before, a night sister had stood in the cold waiting for a crew that never came. And he keyed his radio one last time and he called control and he cleared the call. He reported Vehicle 7 inbound and arrived. He reported the patient delivered safe, the job done. He asked in the plain words of the log that the call be struck through and closed. And on the far side of the moor, in the empty station, the steady dispatcher, who had known all along, who had been afraid all along, wrote it down at last, and drew her line through the oldest open call on the book, and closed it after 20 years. When he looked up from his radio, the old ambulance was there in the forecourt behind him, drawn up quiet at the doors, its light no longer turning. And as he watched, the two men straightened from their work and looked toward the warm lit doors of the hospital as though they could see, at last, that they were open. He did not see the rest, and he was glad of it, because some things are not for us to watch. He only knows that when he looked again the forecourt was empty, and the fog was lifting off the moor, and the road behind him was only a road. And he understood then what the old dispatcher had never quite let himself do, that the crew had not needed to be fled from, and had not needed to be feared. They had only needed to be told that they were home. I've thought a good deal about why he carried this story so long before he gave it to me, and I think it is the strangeness of the mercy in it, that the thing on the road was never a horror at all, but a duty that no one had ever helped to lay down, because the dead are not always out there to take something from us. Sometimes they are still trying to give, still carrying in the fog, the last of a burden they took up in kindness and were never allowed to set down. And some journeys, it turns out, are only ever finished when someone living comes along and helps carry them the last mile. That's where I'll leave him and leave you, with a road gone quiet, and a call struck through at last, and two good men let go home after a long night's work. Not everything that waits for you in the dark means you harm. Some of it is only waiting to be told that it did enough. If you'd sit up in the fog for a story like this one, then do me a kindness before you go, like, share and subscribe, so the next tale finds its way to you when the night comes down. And if the comments are open, tell me, have you ever felt on some empty road in the small hours that you were not quite the only one driving it? Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning in the window if you'd rather, for anyone still out on the road. And if you ever find yourself alone in the fog at the dead hour and something calls to you for help, calm and tired and kind, be careful and be wise and keep your own wheels turning. But do not be too quick to call it a horror. Some of the dead are only still trying to finish what they began. Good night. There is a kind of silence that only gathers in a house that was built for prayer. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is a held silence, as though the walls have spent so many hundreds of years leaning toward a single voice that they cannot quite believe it has stopped. Up on Cold Fell, in a monastery given over to the winter, one man learned that the silence in that place was not empty at all. Something in it was still keeping the hours, and on the worst nights, it wanted him to keep them too. Good evening. Come in out of the cold and sit down before we climb up onto that fell, because this is a story that keeps to the old hours, and it is better told late, with the lamp turned low and the door shut fast against the dark. I'm the one who tells these tales. I gather the ones that people carry quietly for half their lives, the ones they will only set down at the very end of a long night, when they are too tired at last to go on guarding them, and I sit with each one until it settles into something I can hand across to you. Tonight's story came to me from a man who spent a single winter as the caretaker of a hillside monastery, keeping the buildings while the brothers were away, and who never afterward could hear a church bell in the small hours without going still and gray. So draw your chair up to the fire, and let me tell you about a cloister, a locked chapel, and an office that no living hand has rung for a very long time. The man at the heart of it had come to the work the way a good many men come to a quiet post, because the world had worn him thin, and he wanted a place its noise could not reach. He had lost someone the year before, in the ordinary and unanswerable way that people are lost, and had found he could no longer bear the company of the living, nor his own rooms with the empty chair in them. He was not a religious man, or did not think he was. But when he saw that a monastery on the northern fells wanted a caretaker to keep the place through the cold months, it seemed to him the nearest thing to disappearing that a living man could honestly do. He wrote to them, and they took him on. He would come to understand before the winter was over that there are places where a man goes to be alone, and that not one of them is ever quite as empty as it looks. The monastery stood high on the shoulder of Cold Fell, 3 miles of climbing track above the last village, in a fold of the hill where the wind came round the buildings on both sides and met itself again beyond. It was old, older than the village, older than the road, a long low huddle of gray stone with a squat church at its heart and a cloister running square around a garth of frozen grass. In the good months 12 brothers kept it, elderly men, the last of a shrinking house. But the buildings could not be warmed through the worst of the winter, and so each year, when the snow came down, the whole community went down to a grange in the dale and left the great cold house to keep itself until the spring. That was the caretaker's winter, to keep it, and let no roof fall in while the brothers were gone. He came up on the last cart before the snow closed the track, and the prior himself, the oldest of them and the last to leave, stayed past his own going to walk the new man through the place, the stoves, the oil store, the well, the long echoing walk of the cloister, patient and unhurried, the way old men are with a thing they are glad to be handing on. And then at the gate the prior told him the one thing that was in none of the papers he had signed. Put into my own words, it was this: keep the house and keep it well and walk where you please by day. But at the far end of the east walk of the cloister there is a chapel, an old one half fallen that is kept locked, and you are to leave it locked. And above all else, if ever you should wake in the dead middle of the night to a bell ringing from that end of the cloister, a small handbell tolling slow for the night office, and hear under it a single voice at prayer where you know there is no living soul, you are to stay in your bed. You are not to go and see. You are not to answer it. Whatever it seems to be asking, however you come to know the words, you are not to make the responses. Let it pray, keep to your room, and in the morning it will be only a locked door again. The caretaker took that for what it plainly sounded like, the sort of tale an old house grows the way an old tree grows moss, handed down from one keeper to the next because it made the long nights feel less empty. He thanked the prior, and he watched the cart go down and vanish into the dusk, and then he was alone on the fell with a ring of iron keys and the wind, and the great gray house settling around him into the dark. He lit the stove in the porter's lodge where he was to sleep, and he made himself tea, and he told himself it was only cold stone and only weather. And for that first night at least, there was nothing in the cloister but the wind, and the far streams running under the ice and his own footsteps going round. That much was still true. It would not stay true for long. He kept the house well those first days, and I want to be fair to him about that because it matters to what came after. He was a careful man, and the work suited the gray mood that was on him. He walked the corridors morning and evening with a lamp, and he fed the stoves, and he swept the drift of leaves that came in under the cloister doors, and he learned the great cold building the way you learn a face. The long north walk that never saw the sun, the chapter house with its ring of empty stone seats, the church with its cold altar and its rows of dark stalls where the brothers sat to sing. And at the far end of the east walk, past the last of the arches, he found the locked chapel the prior had spoken of. It was the oldest part of the whole place, plainly, a small, low, half-ruined thing, older than the church beside it, with a roof that had fallen in on one side long ago and been rudely patched, and one narrow window of thick old glass, and a heavy door with a black iron lock that his keys did not fit. He stood before it more than once in those first days, in the gray afternoon light, and felt nothing from it but the ordinary sadness of a broken thing left to the weather. He put his hand flat on the cold wood of the door once, and it was only wood. He was almost disappointed. He went back to his stoves. The snow came in earnest on his 5th or 6th night, and it changed the quality of the dark. It came down without any wind at all, straight and silent and steady, until the whole fell was muffled under it, and the last small sounds of the world, the streams, the distant valley, were smothered one by one, and the silence that the prior's rule had hinted at came down over the monastery like a held breath. He lay in his narrow bed in the porter's lodge that night and listened to the sheer size of the quiet, and could not sleep for the weight of it. And it was somewhere in the dead middle of that night, at the low black hour when even the fell seemed to have stopped, that he first heard the bell. It was a small bell, a handbell by the sound, the kind a man might carry and swing, not the great cast bell in the church tower, but a light bright chime with a mortal hand behind it, close and clear across the snow. And it was not ringing at random. It rang slow and deliberate and evenly spaced, the way a bell is rung to call men to prayer, a summons and not an accident, tolling out of the far end of the cloister where the locked chapel stood, and where there was no living soul but himself in 3 miles of snow. He sat up in the black cold with his heart going hard, and he told himself, the way you do, that a rope had come loose somewhere, that the frost had shifted an old fitting, that there was a mortal and mechanical reason for it if only he went and found it. But a loose bell swings and clatters. This one kept time. It kept the slow, patient, unhurried time of a thing being done properly, by someone in no doubt of what he was about. And as the caretaker sat and listened to it toll out of the buried dark, some older and wiser part of him understood, before his reason would allow it, that no rope and no frost had ever rung a bell like that. And then under the bell, so faint at first that he took it for the blood in his own ears, there came a voice. It was a man's voice, and it was singing not a song, but the long, level, rising and falling line of plain chant, the old wordless-seeming chant of the monastic office, one phrase given out and then a silence, and then the phrase answered by the same single voice taking up the next. It came from the far end of the cloister, from the direction of the locked chapel, low and unhurried and grave, and it was the loneliest sound he had ever heard in his life, because it was the sound of a man keeping the night office entirely alone, one voice doing the work of a whole choir, calling and answering himself, in a chapel where the prior had sworn to him no one had prayed in longer than living memory. He did not go and see. He wants me to tell you that, and I will. Whatever cold sense the prior's words had left in him held him where he was, sitting up in his bed with the blanket gripped in both hands, listening to a dead man sing the hours out of the snow. The bell tolled, and the single voice rose and fell and answered itself, and it went on for the better part of an hour by his watch, until the black turned toward gray, and the chant sank down and thinned and faded, and the bell rang once more and was still. And in the morning, when he made himself walk down the east cloister in the hard, clean daylight, there was only the locked chapel at the end of it, silent, its narrow window dark, its black lock cold, and the snow before its door lying smooth and unbroken, with not one footprint anywhere upon it, going in or coming out. He did not sleep much the next day, and I don't suppose any of us would have. He went about his work in a kind of daze, and all the while some part of him kept returning to the sound of it, not to the fear of it exactly, but to the terrible loneliness in it, the patience of a man singing both halves of a prayer to himself because no one was left to sing the other half. That was the thing that got under his guard. He could have borne a horror more easily than he could bear that. And he found, as the short day dimmed toward another long night, that he was not so much dreading the bell as waiting for it. It came again in the dead hour, as he had known it would. The snow had held, and the silence with it, and the small clear bell tolled up out of the far dark exactly as before, slow and grave and certain, and under it the single voice rose into the chant. And this time the caretaker did not stay in his bed. He tells me he does not fully know why, only that the loneliness of it drew him the way warmth draws a cold man, and that he thought God help him, he thought, that there could be no great harm in only looking, in only seeing with his own eyes the thing that grieved so. He took up his lamp, and he went out into the cloister, into the black cold, and he walked the long east walk toward the sound. The chant grew as he went, and the bell with it, until he came to the last arch before the locked chapel and stopped, because there was light ahead of him where there had no business being any. The narrow old window of the ruined chapel, the one dark pane he had passed a dozen times by day, was glowing. It was a warm light, a low, steady, golden light, the color of many candles or of a fire well kept, spilling out through the thick old glass onto the snow, and it should not have been there at all, for the chapel was locked and empty and half open to the sky, and no man had carried a candle into it in 50 years. But it glowed, warm and golden and alive, in the one place on that whole frozen fell where warmth could not be. And out of it came the bell and the grave, unhurried voice, keeping the office. He went closer, unable to help it, and came up to the window with his own lamp shaking in his hand, and he looked in through the old warped glass, and this is what he saw, and he swore it to me, and I believed him. The chapel within was whole, not ruined, whole and warm and lit, as it must have been long ago, with candles burning in it and the fallen roof somehow entire overhead, a small snug space of gold light in the middle of the buried dark. There were old carved stalls along one wall, the kind the brothers sat in to sing, and in one of them alone sat the shape of a man in the dark habit of the house, his head bowed over a book, his hands folded, keeping the office. The caretaker could not see his face, and was glad of it, for the man's hood was up. Only the dark curve of him bent over his prayer in the candlelight, rising to give out the chant and sinking again to answer it, alone, alone, as he had plainly been alone in that warm gold room for longer than the caretaker's whole life. And then the caretaker saw the thing that turned his blood, though there was nothing violent in it at all. Beside the bowed figure in the row of stalls there was an empty place, and it had been made ready. A book lay open upon its ledge, and a candle burned beside it, unlit by any hand he could see, and the whole small, warm room seemed arranged around that one waiting seat, as though it had been kept ready, night after night, year after year, for someone who had not yet come to fill it. And as the chant reached the end of a phrase and fell into its silence, the caretaker understood, standing frozen at the glass, that the silence was the place where the other voice should come. The bowed man was not singing both halves of the office because he wished to. He was singing both halves because he was waiting, in every held silence, for a second voice to take up the answer. And the empty stall and the open book and the lit candle were for whoever would. He did not answer it. He stood at the window with the response rising in his own throat like water, wanting to be given, for the shape of the chant was so old and so patient that some part of him already knew where the answer fell, and he shut his teeth on it, and he stepped back from the glass. The gold light did not follow him. The bowed figure did not lift its head. But as he turned and went back down the long dark cloister, faster than he wanted to admit, he felt the whole warm waiting quiet of the place lean after him, gently, the way a lonely man leans toward the one visitor who has come to his door in years and does not want him to go. He could not let it lie after that, and I don't suppose any of us could have. The chant had stopped being a horror to him somewhere at that lit window and had become a question, and a man can run from a horror, but he cannot easily run from a question that grieves him. So the next day, instead of sleeping, he went looking for what the house itself remembered. There was a room off the cloister that served the community as a kind of library and records room, cold and dry, its shelves stacked with the ledgers and account books and registers of a house that had kept its own memory in ink for centuries. If the answer to the bell was anywhere, he thought, it was there. He lit a lamp against the gray, and he began to read. It took him 2 days. He read the annals of the house, the plain year-by-year setting down of a monastery's small business, the harvests, the deaths, the visitations, the endless keeping of the hours. And folded in among the older books he found the one that mattered, a heavy worn register that had been the porter's book, the record kept at the gate by the brother whose office it was to answer the door of the house, to take in the traveler, to feed the poor, to turn the wheel of hospitality that such a place had turned for 1,000 years. He read it backward, from the newer hands toward the old, and near the middle of it, in a winter of long ago, he found the thing he had been afraid he would find. And the story he pieced together from that book, and from the annals beside it, put into my own words and softened where it needs to be, was this. There had been a brother in that house in the hard years who kept the gate, the porter, the one who answered the door. A grave and careful man, by all the book showed of him, exact in his duties, never late to the office, never once at fault in the small daily rule of the place. And on a night of terrible snow, a night much like the ones now closing over the fell, someone had come up the track to the gate of the monastery in the dark, seeking shelter. A woman, the porter's book had it, with a child, travelers caught by the weather on the high road, half dead with cold, begging at the door of a house that existed, that had always existed, for exactly such nights as that. And the brother at the gate had not let them in. The caretaker read the reasons the man had written for himself, and they were the small gray reasonable reasons that let a decent person do a terrible thing. That the rule of the house forbade a woman pass the gate at that hour, that he could not be sure they were what they seemed, and the house had been robbed before by those who played on its charity, that the guest master was abed and it was not his, the porter's, place to decide, that they could go down to the village, which was only 3 miles, and be taken in there. Reason on reason, each one true enough, and the sum of them was that he had turned a mother and a child away from a warm door into the snow and barred it and gone back to his prayers. And in the spring, when the drifts went off the fell, they had been found not half a mile below the gate, where the cold had taken them in the night, sitting down together in the snow the way the frozen do, as though only resting. That much was in the porter's book, in the man's own hand, in a script that grew smaller and more crabbed as it went, as though he could barely bear to shape the words. But it was the annals of the house that told the rest, and the caretaker read it late, by the failing lamp, with the cold coming up through the floor. The brother had never confessed it. That was the heart of the whole matter. He had gone to his confession as every brother did, and he had told his small daily faults, his idle thoughts and his lapses at prayer, and this one thing, the great gray killing thing he had done at the gate, he had never once been able to speak aloud. He had carried it unshriven and unabsolved to the end of his days, keeping the office faithfully, keeping the rule exactly, a man perfect in everything but the one thing that mattered, and he had died at last still holding it, unforgiven because unconfessed, and had asked in his last illness only this: to be buried not in the brother's ground but apart, in the old ruined chapel at the far end of the cloister, so that he might go on keeping the night office there, alone, and go on praying to be forgiven for a fault he could not bring himself to name, for as long as it took. And the house, not knowing the whole of why, had granted it, and he had been keeping it ever since. The caretaker closed the porter's book with hands that were not quite steady, and he understood at last what it was that sang in the dark at the far end of the cloister, and what the empty stall was for. It was not a monster keeping vigil in that warm gold room. It was a man, a grave, exact, terribly ordinary man, who had done one cold thing on one cold night and had never been able to say it, and who had been kneeling in the dark ever since, keeping the office and begging to be forgiven, and getting no answer because the only voice that could answer him was one he could not raise himself. You cannot forgive yourself. That is the whole cruelty of it. He had sung both halves of the office for 50 years and more, calling into the silence and answering himself, because absolution is a thing that must come from another voice, and no other voice had ever come. And the seat stood empty, and the candle burned, and the book lay open, waiting, night after night, for whoever would at last come and make the response. He knew now what the prior's rule had been guarding him from, and it was not what he had thought. The danger was not that the thing in the chapel would harm him. The danger was that it would ask him to help, in the one way it knew how to ask, and that he would say yes. For the office wants two voices. And a lonely man who has kept it alone for half a century, and who feels a living warmth come at last to his window in the dark, will draw that warmth toward the empty stall with everything he has, and hold the silence open for it, and wait for it to sing the answer, and a living man who sits down in that stall and takes up that response might never rise from it again. He might keep the night office in that warm gold room forever, a second bowed shape in the candlelight so that the first would no longer be alone. That was the mercy the dead man wanted, and it was a mercy that would cost a living soul everything. The prior had known it. Keep to your bed, he had said. Do not answer. Let it pray. The worst night of that winter came near the end of it, and the caretaker knew it would be a bad one from the moment the light went out of the sky, because the snow came down heavier than he had seen it yet, and the silence with it was total, a silence with a shape to it, a silence that seemed to be waiting for him particularly. He sat up in the porter's lodge with the lamp lit, and the porter's book on the table before him, and swore to himself that he would not go out, whatever came. And in the dead hour the bell began. It was different that night. It rang, and the single voice rose into the chant as it always did, but this time in the first held silence where the answer should fall, the voice did not answer itself. It waited. It left the silence open, and it held it open longer than any breath, and the caretaker felt the whole of that held silence turn toward him across the snow, toward the porter's lodge, toward the one warm living thing on the whole frozen fell, and he understood that the dead brother knew now that he had come, and had read the book and knew the words and could give the answer, and was being asked, in that aching open silence, to come and give it. He got up from the table. He does not think he told himself to. He found himself in the cloister with the lamp in his hand and the snow whispering down, walking the long east walk toward the warm gold light in the window, and the bell tolling him on, and the silence held open before him like a door. And when he came to the chapel this time, the door was not locked. It stood open, and the gold light spilled out warm across the snow, and within was the small whole candle-lit room and the bowed figure in its stall, and beside it the empty place made ready, the open book, the lit candle, the worn ledge worn smooth as though by the hands of one who had waited a long time to see it filled. And the figure lifted its head. It did not show him a face. He was spared that, and I am glad for him. It only turned in the candlelight toward the empty stall beside it, and toward him in the doorway, and it held the silence open, and it waited for him to come in out of the cold and sit down, and take up the book, and sing the answer, and never be cold or alone again. And the caretaker felt his foot cross the threshold, and felt the warmth of that room reach out and fold around him like the arms of the thing he had lost the year before, and heard, rising in his own throat, unbidden, the first note of the response. What stopped him in the end was not the prior's rule, and it was not fear. It was the porter's book, and the one thing in it he had not been able to put down, that the man in the stall was not truly asking to be joined. He only thought he was. He had knelt so long in the dark that he had come to believe what he needed was a second voice to share the endless keeping of the hours. But the caretaker understood, standing on that threshold with the response dying in his throat, what the man in the stall did not, that to sit down in that empty place would not free the brother. It would only bind them both, two bowed shapes keeping a vigil that could never end. What the office was truly waiting for had never been a second singer. It was an answer of another kind, not the response of the prayer, but the response to the man. So he did not sit down. He stood in the doorway with the silence held open and every cold hour of that winter pulling him toward the empty stall, and instead of singing the answer the office wanted, he gave the answer the man wanted, the one no one had ever given him. He spoke into the held silence, aloud in his own plain living voice, and did for the brother the thing the brother had never been able to do for himself. He named the fault. He said what had been done at the gate on the night of the snow, the whole gray killing truth of it, spoken plainly at last. The confession the man could never make with his own mouth, made for him now by another. And then he said the rest of it, the part that mattered more. He said that it was known and heard, and at the very last forgiven, that the woman and the child in the snow, wherever the mercy of the world had taken them, did not hold it against him any longer, and that he could lay it down. He forgave him, not as a priest, for he was no priest, and I do not think it needed one, but the way one cold and grieving human being can forgive another across whatever gulf it is that lies between the living and the dead, completely, out loud, and with the whole of his own broken heart. And the office finished. He tells me the silence that had been held open so long simply closed, gently, the way a held breath is finally let go, and that the bowed figure in the stall lifted its head at last, not toward him, but upward, the way a man looks up when a great weight is lifted off him from above. He only knows that the grave, unhurried voice gave out one more phrase of the chant, the last of it, the end of the office, and that this time, for the first time in half a century, it did not have to answer itself. And then the candles in that warm gold room burned down together and went out, and the light left the window, and the caretaker was standing alone in the doorway of a cold ruined chapel open to the snow and the stars, an old locked door swinging quietly on its hinge, and a great and final silence that had, at last, nothing left in it that was waiting. He kept the rest of his winter on cold fell, and the bell never rang again. When the snow went off the track in the spring and the brothers came back up from the dale, he told the prior only that the house had been quiet, and the old man looked at him a long moment and asked him nothing more, as though he could see for himself that the far chapel was only a locked door now, and would stay one. He went down off the fell when his work was done, and he did not disappear as he had meant to, and I think that is the truest part of it. He had gone up there to be alone with his own grief, and had come down having sat with someone else's, having done the one thing his own year of loss had taught him the worth of, to tell a soul in the dark that it is heard, and forgiven, and may at last put its burden down. I've thought a good deal about why he carried this so long before he gave it to me, and I think it is the shape of the mercy in it, that the thing keeping the office on the fell was never a horror at all, but a penance no one had ever come to end. Because the dead are not always out there to frighten us, or to take something from us. Sometimes they are only kneeling in the dark, keeping a vigil they were never absolved of, waiting with a patience that ought to break your heart for one living voice to come and say the words that let them rest. Not everything that keeps the hours in the dark means you harm. Some of it is only waiting to be forgiven. That's where I'll leave him and leave you, with a chapel gone quiet, an office finished at last, and one grave and ordinary soul let go home after a very long night. If you'd sit up in the small hours for a story like this one, then do me a kindness before you go. Like it, share it, and subscribe, so the next tale finds its way to you when the dark comes down. And if the comments are open, tell me, have you ever felt, alone in some old and quiet place, that you were not quite the only one keeping watch? Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning in the window if you'd rather, for anyone still out in the cold. And if you ever wake in the dead hour to a bell you cannot account for, and a lonely voice at prayer where there should be none, be careful and be wise, and keep to your bed as the wise ones tell you. But do not be too quick to call it a monster. Some of the dead are only still praying to be forgiven, and the bravest thing a living soul can do when the night office calls is to find the words that let it stop. Good night. There is a kind of quiet that only comes to a building that once made a great deal of noise. It is not the quiet of an empty field or of a still room. It is a waiting quiet, the held quiet of 1,000 machines lately stopped, as though the walls have gone on listening for a sound they were built around, and cannot quite believe has ended. Down on the old canal, in a woolen mill shut up for the winter, one man learned that the quiet in that place was not empty at all. Something in it was still working the night shift, and on the worst nights it wanted him to clock in. Good evening. Come in and shut the door on the cold before we go down to that water, because this is a story that keeps late hours, and it is better told with the lamp turned low and the frost thick on the glass. I'm the one who tells these tales. I gather the ones that people carry quietly for the whole of their lives, the ones they will only set down very late at night, when they are too tired at last to keep guarding them, and I sit with each until it settles into something I can hand across to you. Tonight's story came to me from a man who spent a single winter as the night watchman of an empty mill on a dead canal, and who never afterward could stand in a silent building without listening, without meaning to, for machines starting up. So draw your chair to the fire, and let me tell you about a mill, a set of plans, and a floor that no living hand has worked in a very long time. The man at the heart of it had come to the work the way a good many men come to a lonely post, because it was steady and solitary, and asked very little of him but that he stay awake. He had watched warehouses and yards before, and liked the night for the plain reason that it made no demands. When the agent for a shut mill down on the canal wanted a man to keep it through the cold months, to walk it, warm it enough that the pipes would not burst, and let no thief strip the good brass and copper out of it, it seemed to him easy money and quiet company. He took it. He would come to understand in that mill that a building can be empty of the living and still be a very crowded place indeed. The mill stood where the canal went black and still between two locks, a great gaunt block of soot-dark stone 6 stories high, with row upon row of tall windows staring blind over the water. In its working years it had spun and woven wool for half the county, but the trade had gone, the looms had been sold for scrap or left to seize, and now the whole vast place stood powered down and cold, kept only from falling in. The watchman was to live in the gatehouse by the yard, and to walk the mill twice in every night, once before midnight and once in the dead small hours, carrying a lamp, and the one thing the work truly turned on, which was the clock. It was a watchman's clock of the old kind, and it matters to what came after. It was a heavy drum of brass and leather that he wore on a strap across his shoulder, and it kept a paper dial turning slowly inside it through the night. Set about the mill, at the head of every stair and the end of every floor, were the stations, little iron boxes, each with a numbered key hung on a chain beside it. On his round he was to take the key at each station and turn it in the clock, and the clock would prick that number and that hour onto the turning paper, so that in the morning the dial showed, in a ring of small clean marks, that a living man had truly walked the whole building and stood at every post. He could not fake it. The clock kept him honest, and the key at each station was the proof that he had been there. Remember the keys and the marks they made. They are the whole of it in the end. The old watchman he was relieving met him at the gate on his first evening to hand over the round, a gray and careful man who had kept the mill for years and was going at last to live with his daughter. He walked the new man through it patiently, the boiler house, the weaving sheds, the long stacked floors, the stations one by one, and gave him the ring of station keys and the folded mill plan he was to keep the round by. And then, at the foot of the main stair before he went, the old man told him the one thing that was on none of the plans and in none of the papers. Put into my own words, it was this: walk the round and walk it true and clock every station on the card. But on the 4th floor, at the far dark end past the last of the standing looms, the plan shows a blank wall, and blank wall is all you want there to be. And if ever on your dead hour round you find a door in that wall where the plan swears there is none, and hear, through it, the machines running and a shift at work and a step coming round as though a foreman were walking his own watch, you are to log your round and keep walking and let it be. Do not knock. Do not answer. Above all, do not take that key and do not clock that station. Walk on, and in the morning it will be blank wall again." The watchman took that for what it plainly sounded like. The sort of tale an old building grows the way an old coat grows its own shape, handed from one keeper to the next because it made the long nights feel peopled. He thanked the old man and watched him go off over the bridge into the dusk, and then he was alone in the gatehouse with the great dark mill standing over the black water. He lit his stove and filled his clock with fresh paper and set out on his first round, and it was only cold stone and stopped machines. And for that first night at least, there was nothing in the mill but his own lamp, his own step, and the small clean pricks of the clock marking each station as he came to it. That much was still true. It would not stay true for long. He kept the mill well those first nights, and I want to be fair to him about that, because it matters to what came after. He was a careful man, and the plain round suited him. He learned the great cold building the way you learn a strange house in the dark, the boiler house with its dead furnaces, the ground floor sheds where the last looms stood rusting in their rows, the stacked upper floors where the light came gray through the tall windows and lay in long bars on the dusty boards. He walked it twice a night with his lamp and his clock, took each station key in its turn, and by day he slept in the gatehouse and thought the winter would pass easily enough. He came to know the plan as well as the mill. It was an old drawing, foxed and soft with handling, that laid out every floor stair by stair and post by post, with the station numbers marked on it in a neat old hand. He kept the round by it faithfully, and after the first week he barely needed it, for his feet had the way of the building by heart. There were 14 stations on the card. He clocked all 14, twice a night, and the dial in the morning showed its clean ring of marks, and the agent, when he came by, said the mill had never been better kept. It was on the 4th floor that the plan and the building first failed to agree. The 4th floor was the highest of the great weaving floors, a long, low room the whole length of the mill, with the standing looms ranked down it in the dark like the pews of some drowned church. His station up there, number 9 on the card, was screwed to a pillar near the stairhead, and he clocked it each round and thought no more of it. But the plan showed the floor running on past that pillar to a plain blank wall at the far end, and one night, holding his lamp up at Station 9, he found himself looking down the long room toward that end, and thinking, in the idle way a man thinks on a quiet round, that the floor seemed to go a good deal further than the plan allowed. He paced it the next night out of nothing but curiosity. He walked the length of the 4th floor from the stairhead to the far wall, counting his steps, and then he went down and paced the 3rd floor beneath it the same way and counted again. And the 4th floor was shorter. By a good many strides it was shorter than the floor below it, as though somewhere at that dark end, behind the blank wall the plan showed, there was a stretch of the building that the 4th floor was not being allowed to reach. He did the sum of it twice, and it came out the same both times. There was a room up there at the end of the 4th floor that was walled off and left off the plan, and that no station on his card would ever take him into. He told himself the sensible things. That old mills were built and rebuilt a dozen times, and half their walls made no sense. That a floor might have been shortened for 100 honest reasons, a bad beam, a dropped hoist, a room shut up for damp and simply never redrawn. That it was nothing to him, whose whole business was to walk the round and keep the pipes from freezing, not to go measuring walls in the dark like a man looking for trouble. And all of that was true, and none of it settled him, because a careful man does not like a building that lies to him, and the plan, he was now sure, was lying. The next dead hour round he went up to the 4th floor and walked, for the first time, past Station 9, past where his round properly ended, down the long dark aisle between the standing looms toward the blank end wall, holding the lamp before him. And the wall was there just as the plan said, a plain, blank, soot-dark stretch of brick, older looking than the wall around it, with no door in it and no window, running floor to ceiling across the end of the room. He put his hand flat against it, and it was only cold brick. He stood a while, feeling foolish, and then he went back to Station 9 and clocked his round and went down to the gatehouse and told himself the matter was closed. But he had noticed one thing at that wall that he did not tell himself about, because it would not fit anywhere he could put it. The wall was cold, as all the mill was cold, but along the bottom of it, where a door's threshold would be if there had ever been a door, the cold had a different quality, a faint, low, steady warmth breathing out from under the brick, the way warmth comes from under the door of a room where a fire is kept and everyone else has gone to bed. And a blank wall with a warm draft coming out from under it is a thing a careful man does not like at all. He did not sleep well the next day, and I don't suppose any of us would have. He kept coming back over his cold dinner to the warmth at the foot of that wall, and to the plain arithmetic of a floor that came up short, and he found, as the early dark came down over the canal, that he was not so much dreading his dead hour round as waiting for it. That is how these things take a careful man, not by a fright at first, by a question he cannot leave alone. The dead hour round fell somewhere around 2 in the morning, when the whole frost-bound valley had gone as still as a stopped heart, and that night, as he climbed the last stair to the 4th floor with his lamp and his clock, he heard it before he reached the top. A sound was coming down the stairwell to meet him, a low, deep, working sound, felt in the boards of the stair before it was heard in the ear at all. It was the great, patient, rhythmic clatter and thump of looms at the weave, the long shafts turning and the belts slapping and the shuttles going to and fro, the whole vast heartbeat of a mill in full work, and it was coming from the 4th floor, where every loom had stood dead and seized for 30 years, in a building with no power in it and no soul awake but himself. He came up onto the 4th floor and stood at the stairhead with the lamp shaking a little in his hand, and the standing looms were there in the dark exactly as they always were, rusted and still, not one wheel of them turning. And yet the sound of them working rolled down the long room out of the blank end, past Station 9. From behind the wall the plan said was solid. It came muffled through the brick, as a sound comes through a wall from a room next door, the running of the machines, and under it, threading through it, the small human sounds of a shift at work, the scrape of clogs on boards, the far, flat call of a voice raised over the din, though he could not catch a word of it. And every little while, cutting through all of it, a slow, heavy tread coming round on the boards on the far side, a measured step, pausing and going on, exactly as a man walks who is pacing a floor he is set to watch, as a foreman walks his round, as he thought with the cold going down his back, a watchman walks his own. He went down the long aisle toward it, because he could not help it, holding the lamp before him, and he came at last to the blank end wall. And the wall was not blank anymore. There was a door in it. It stood in the soot-dark brick where that afternoon there had been nothing at all, a plain heavy mill door, iron-strapped, old, with a wired glass panel in the upper half of it and a station box screwed to the brick beside it, a station he had never seen, with a numbered key hung waiting on its chain. And through the wired glass there was light. Not the gray, dead dark of the rest of the mill, but a warm, low, working light, the yellow of gas mantles and oil, and moving across it, dim through the dirty glass, the shapes of the shift. He could not see them clearly, and he was glad of that ever after. He could see only that the floor beyond the door was alive and lit and full, that figures were moving between the ranked looms bowed and busy, and paying him no mind at all, and that among them, coming slowly up the aisle toward the door with an even and unhurried step, was the shape of the one who walked the round. He did not knock, and he did not answer, and it was not courage that stopped him but the plain memory of the old man's face at the foot of the stair. He stood at the wired glass with the warmth of that working floor breathing onto his cold hands, and the loom clatter filling the whole dark, and the numbered key hanging waiting beside him. And he understood that all he need do to be part of it, all that a floor which had waited so long for a man to come round was asking of him, was to take that key and turn it in his clock and clock in. And some part of him, God help him, wanted to, the way a cold man wants a lit and crowded room. He put his hand behind his back like a man taking it out of the way of a fire, and he turned and walked back down the long aisle to Station 9, and clocked his own honest round there with his own honest key, and went down out of the mill into the frost, and behind him the machines ran on. He could not let it lie after that, and I don't suppose any of us could have. The floor behind the wall had stopped being a question and become a grief to him, though he could not yet have told you why, for there had been nothing cruel in it, nothing that reached for him, only a shift at its work and a door left open and a key hung waiting, patient as the grave. So the next day, instead of sleeping, he went looking for what the mill itself remembered. There was an office off the yard, a damp, cold counting house where the mill had kept its books, its shelves still stacked with the ledgers of a place that had written down its every hour for 100 years. If there was an answer, he thought, it was in the ink. He lit his lamp against the gray, and he began to read. It took him 3 cold nights of it between his rounds. He read the order books and the stock books and the long, dull rolls of the working mill, and folded in among the oldest of them he found the 2 that mattered. One was a wages book, the great ruled ledger in which the mill set down, week by week, every hand it paid and the money each was owed. The other was thinner and newer and kept apart from the rest, in a different and more careful hand, a book of accidents, the record a mill was made to keep of every hurt that came to its people at the machines. He read them side by side, backward from the newer pages toward the old, and near the middle of the wages book, in a winter of long ago, he found the thing he had been half afraid he would find. And the story he pieced together from those 2 books, and from what the old watchman told him afterward when he went and asked, put into my own words and softened where it needs to be, was this. There had been a night shift on the 4th floor, in the mill's hard years, set to the looms through the dark hours to keep the great engines earning while the town slept. Young women, mostly, and girls, and a few older hands, and over them an overlooker and a night watchman to walk the building. The wages book had them all week upon week. A long column of names in the clerk's neat hand paid their few shillings against that floor. And then, on one week in the deep of one winter, the column simply ended. A ruled line was drawn under it hard, and the names did not carry on into the next week, nor ever again. 24 of them, or near it, stopped in a single stroke of the pen. The accident book told the why of it in its way, though it plainly did not tell the whole. It recorded, for that same night, a fire broken out on the 4th floor in the dead of the shift, from an overrun bearing or a lamp. It was never made certain, and gone through the oiled and dust-choked room faster than anyone could stand against it. And here was the thing the watchman read 3 times over by his failing lamp. The one stair down from that floor had been kept locked. It had been the mill's practice to lock the shift in at their work through the night, to bolt the stair door from the outside against pilfering and against hands slipping away before their time. And on the night of the fire the door had been locked as it always was, and the man with the key had not reached it in time. And the shift on the 4th floor had not been able to get out. The accident book gave a number of the dead, and it was a small number, far smaller than the ruled-off column in the wages book beside it, and there the watchman first felt the true cold of the thing. For the 2 books did not agree, and the lie between them was the whole of the matter. The mill had not wanted a fire on that scale to be known. A fire that killed a locked-in night shift would have brought the inspectors and the coroner and the newspapers down on the master, and questions about the bolted door that no money could answer. And so it had been made smaller. The number was put down low. The floor was given out as long shut and empty when it burned. And the dead, the 24 names ruled off in a single stroke, were quietly not named at all. No inquest that told the truth, no stone that carried their names, buried, the old watchman said, in a common grave beyond the town with no mark on it to say who lay there, or how they came to lie there so young and all together. The floor where they had died was bricked off and struck from the plans, and in a few years there was no one left who would say aloud that it had ever been a working floor at all. And there they had gone on, the watchman understood, closing the wages book with hands that were not quite steady, working their shift in the dark behind the wall, waiting through all the long years for someone to do the one thing that had never been done for them. Not to save them. It was too late for that and had been for a lifetime. Only to know their names and to say them, and to set it down at last that they had been there and had died and had been wronged. The watchman sat a long while in the cold counting house with the 2 books open before him, and he understood at last what it was that worked in the dark behind the wall, and what the waiting key was for. It was not a horror keeping the night shift up there. It was a shift of ordinary people, locked into their work one winter night and burned, and then made small and swept under, so that no one was ever made to answer for the bolted door and no stone carried their names. They had been robbed twice, once of their lives and once of the record that they had ever lived them, and a thing that has been struck out of the record wants, above all else that the dead can want, to be written back in. He knew now, too, what the old man's rule had been guarding him from, and it was not what he had first taken it for. The danger on the 4th floor was not that the shift would reach for him or do him any harm. There was no harm in them and never had been. The danger was the key. For the shift wanted to be joined. That was how it knew to ask, and having waited the better part of a century for a living man who walked his own round faithfully in the dark, it would offer him the one thing it had left to offer. A place on the shift, a station of his own, the warm, crowded company of it against the loneliness of his round. And a man who turned that key in his clock and let it prick that station onto his paper would have made himself one of them, would have walked the round in the warm, lit dark forever and never come down the stair into the frost again. The old man had known it. Log your round, he had said, and keep walking. Do not take that key. Do not clock that station. The worst night of that winter came near the end of it, and the watchman knew it would be a bad one from the moment the frost came down harder than he had felt it yet, and the whole valley went so still that his own blood was loud in his ears. He climbed to the 4th floor on his dead-hour round with the 2 books' worth of names heavy in his mind, and the machines were already running behind the wall, louder that night than ever, the whole floor alive with the sound of the shift. And when he came down the long aisle, the door stood in the wall as before, open now, a hand's breadth open, the warm working light spilling across the dusty boards, and the numbered key hung waiting on its chain. And this time the slow, even tread that walked the round did not stay on the far side of the wall. It came to the door. It stood just within the light, dim in the doorway, and it did not show him a face, and I am glad for him that it did not. It only stood and waited, and held the door open, and the whole warm, lit, crowded floor seemed to lean toward him through the gap. Every bowed working figure of it somehow bent now upon the cold man in the dark, and it took the key down off its chain and held it out to him, and it waited for him to come in out of the cold and take his station and clock in and never be alone or frozen on the round again. And he felt his hand come up. He does not think he told it to. He said the warmth of that floor reached out and wrapped round him like the lit doorway of a public house on a bitter night, and that the wanting of it was so plain and so reasonable, that the shift was owed company, that he was owed company, that it would be so small a thing, one turn of a key, and the long cold loneliness of the round would be over, that his fingers had closed halfway toward the offered key before he knew it. The looms roared. The door stood open on the warm and crowded dark, and the numbered key hung waiting in the held-out hand, one small turn from the end of him. What stopped him in the end was not the old man's rule, and it was not fear. It was the wages book, and the one thing in it he had not been able to put down, that the shift behind the wall was not truly asking to be joined. It only thought it was. It had worked so long, struck out of the record, that it had come to believe it needed one more pair of hands at the looms. But the watchman understood, standing at that door with the offered key a hand's breadth from his own, what the shift did not, that to clock in would not free a single soul of them. It would only make him one more name struck off and swept under, the round unbroken and the wrong unrighted forever. What the 4th floor was truly waiting for had never been another worker. It was a witness, not a hand to join the shift, a voice to end it. So he did not take the key. He stepped back from the door, with the warm light on his face and every cold hour of that winter pulling him toward it, and instead of clocking in, he did the thing that had never once been done in all the long years behind the wall. He took the wages book up out of his coat, where he had carried it that night for a reason he could not then have named, and he opened it to the ruled-off column by the light spilling from the door, and he read the shift their own names. Aloud into the roar of the looms, in his own plain living voice, he read out the whole stopped column of them, name by name by name, every girl and every woman and every tired older hand who had been locked in on that floor and burned, and then rubbed out of the record as though they had never come over the bridge to work at all. He named them, and then he said the rest of it, the part that mattered more than the names. He said aloud what had been done to them, the bolted stair, the false low number, the truth of their dying made small so that no one would have to answer for it. He said that it was known now, and that he would not let it lie, that they had been there and had died and had been wronged. He witnessed them, out loud in the dark with the whole of his own plain heart, the one thing no one had done for them in 100 years. And the shift stopped. He tells me the great running clatter of the looms behind the wall did not die away but simply ceased, all at once, the way a held breath is finally let go, and that in the enormous quiet after it he heard, for the first and only time, the sounds of the shift not at their work but at their rest, a long settling, a putting down of things, the small stir of a great many people who have been told at last that they may stop. The shape in the doorway lowered the key. It only stood a moment in the fading warm light, and then it turned, unhurried, and went back in among the others, and the light in the wired glass sank down and thinned and went out. And the watchman was standing alone in the cold dark at the end of the 4th floor, before a plain blank soot-dark wall with no door in it, and no warmth breathing from its foot, and a great and final quiet on the floor that had at last nothing left in it that was waiting. He kept the rest of his winter on the canal, and the machines never ran again. But he did not stop at the wall, and I think that is the truest part of him. He took the wages book and the accident book down the stair with him that night, and when the spring came up the valley, he carried them to a man who wrote for the county paper, and told what the ruled-off column and the false low number and the bolted stair added up to, and would not be talked out of it. And in time, though it was fought harder than it ought to have been, the thing was set down where it could be read, the 4th floor named for what it had been, the shift named for who they were, and a plain stone raised at last over the common grave beyond the town with every one of their names cut into it, so that any who passed could see that they had lived, and had died and had been wronged, and were wronged no longer in silence. I've thought a good deal about why he carried this so long before he gave it to me, and I think it is the shape of the justice in it, that the thing working in the dark behind the wall was never a horror at all, but a wrong that no one had ever come to witness, because the dead are not always out there to frighten us. Sometimes they are only working a shift they were never let off, waiting with a patience that ought to break your heart for one living soul to come round in the dark and read their names aloud and say that it was wrong. Not everything that keeps working in the small hours means you harm. Some of it is only waiting to be counted back in. That's where I'll leave him and leave you, with the looms gone quiet, the floor let go at last, and 24 ordinary souls named on a stone where before there was only grass. If you'd sit up in the small hours for a story like this one, then do me a kindness before you go. Like it, share it, and subscribe, so the next tale finds its way to you when the dark comes down. And if the comments are open, tell me, have you ever stood in an empty building in the small hours and felt, without knowing why, that you were not the only one keeping watch? Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning in the window if you'd rather, for anyone still working late in the cold. And if you ever find yourself alone in some old and silent place in the dead hour, and hear machines running where there is no power, and a step coming round where there should be no one, be careful and be wise, and keep to your own round as the old ones tell you. But do not be too quick to call it a monster. Some of the dead are only waiting to be named, and the bravest thing a living soul can do, when the dead floor calls is not to clock in beside them, but to find the words that let them stop. Good night. There is a kind of silence that lives in a schoolroom after the children have gone home. It is not an empty silence, and it is not a restful one. It is a waiting silence, the held breath of a room that was built to be full, that stands all through the evening with the lessons still chalked on the board and the desk still warm from the day, listening for a morning that has not come yet. High on a winter moor, in a little stone school a long mile from the nearest village, one young woman learned that the silence in that room was not empty at all. One desk in her charge never truly emptied when the children left. It kept its child. And in the dead hour when she stayed late by the lamp, it wanted her to teach him. Good evening. Come in out of the wind and let me shut the door on it, for this is a story that keeps to the cold months, and it is best told with the fire low and the dark pressed up against the glass. I am the one who tells these tales. I gather the ones that people carry quietly for the whole of their lives, the ones they will only set down very late at night, when they are too tired at last to keep the guard up, and I sit with each of them until it settles into something I can hand across to you. Tonight's story came to me from a woman who spent a single winter as the schoolmistress of a one-room school out on the moors, in the days when a village kept its own school and buried its own dead, and who ever afterward kept an empty chair at her own fireside that she would let no guest sit in. So draw up close to the warmth, and let me tell you about a schoolroom, a register of names, and a desk at the back that no living child had sat at for a very long time. The woman at the heart of it had come to the work young, and newly trained, and glad of any post that would have her. She had a gift for children and very little money, and when the county board offered her a winter term at a moor school where the last teacher had left without notice in the middle of the year, she did not ask too closely why. They told her only that the place was remote, and the walk hard in bad weather, and that a young woman of sense would find it lonely. She told them she was fond of her own company and not afraid of a quiet room. She would come to understand, out on that moor, that there is a room that is quiet because it is empty, and then there is a room that is quiet because something in it is waiting very patiently to be spoken to. The school stood by itself on the open fell, a long, low building of gray moorland stone a mile above the village, with the schoolmistress's own small house built onto the end of it, so that she slept, all that winter, with only a wall between her bed and the empty classroom. Inside it was one long room, 2 rows of scarred oak desks with their lifting lids and their inkwells, a stack of slates worn smooth by 40 years of small hands, a black iron stove, a wall of tall windows giving onto the moor, and at the front the high master's desk and the blackboard and the register. 11 children were on the roll that winter, farm children, most of them, who came in over the moor from scattered holdings, some walking 2 and 3 miles each way in the dark of a winter morning, with a scrap of bread in a pocket and their boots wet through before they reached the door. The caretaker was an old man from the village who had tended the school stove and swept its floor through the reign of teacher after teacher, and who knew the building better than any of them. He met her on her first evening to hand it over, showed her the coal, and the well, and the trick of the stove's damper, and the cupboard where the old registers were kept. And before he took up his cap to go, he stopped her by the door and told her the one thing that was written in no book and pinned on no wall. Put into my own words, it was this: mark the 11 you have and never mind the 12th. There are 11 names in that register and no more. Call those 11 at the roll, of a morning and an afternoon, and let that be the whole of your counting. But if ever, marking late by the lamp when the room is dark and empty, you should look up and find there is a child at the back at the desk under the far window, the one that is always meant to stand empty, a quiet one in old-fashioned clothes that you never saw come in and that is on no page of your book, then you are to mark your 11 and close the register and let him be. Do not call the roll for him. Do not set him a place, nor a slate, nor a sum to do. And above all things, never keep the school lit and open past the dead hour for the sake of the child at the back. Ring the children out at the end of the day and put out your lamp, and go home to your own side of the wall. Empty is all you want that desk to be." She took the old man's rule for what it plainly sounded like. The sort of tale, a lonely place grows the way a moor grows its mist, handed down from one teacher to the next, because it made the long dark terms feel peopled. She thanked him, and watched his lantern go bobbing away down the track toward the village lights, and then she was alone with the great quiet room and the wind on the fell. The next morning her 11 came stamping in out of the cold, and she called the roll and heard the 11 small voices answer, and set them their letters and their sums, and it was all as ordinary and good as she had hoped. And for that first week at least, the far desk under the window stood empty, and there were only ever 11. That much was still true. It would not stay true for long. She kept the school well those first weeks, and I want to be fair to her about that because it matters to what came after. She was a good teacher, and the plain rhythm of it suited her. The roll in the morning, the letters and the tables, the reading turn by turn, the dinner eaten round the stove while the sleet came sideways over the moor, and the roll again before she rang them out into the early dark. She learned her 11 quickly, which of them were quick and which were slow, which came hungry, which had the long walk and which the short. By the end of the second week she barely needed the register at all, for she carried the 11 of them in her head as a mother carries her own. Which is why the slate troubled her as much as it did. It was her way, at the end of each day, to gather the children's slates and set them in a stack by the stove to be cleaned, and to look them over first, so that she might know who had understood the day's work and who had not. And one evening, going through the stack by lamplight after the children had gone, she came to a slate she did not know. It was worked over in a careful, cramped, old-fashioned hand, a copperplate such as no child of hers wrote, such as no child had been taught to write in 30 years, and it was doing the day's sums, her sums, the very ones she had set that morning, but doing them slowly and painfully, the figures gone over and over as though the hand that made them were trying with all its heart to get them right. She counted the slates. She had gathered 11 that evening, one from each child, as she always did. And here in her hand was a 12th. She told herself the sensible things, that a child had used 2 slates and she had not marked it, that an old slate had worked its way up from the bottom of the stack, kept from some long-ago term, and she had simply never noticed it before. And all of that was reasonable, and none of it quite fitted, because the sums on the slate were that day's sums, in that day's chalk, still faintly warm to the touch when she pressed her palm against it, as a slate is warm that has been worked on all through the day by a living hand. She wiped it clean, feeling foolish, and set it with the rest, and went round to her own side of the wall and did not sleep especially well. After that she began, without quite meaning to count. And the counting is where it took her, the way these things take a careful person, not by a fright at first, but by a small sum that will not come out right. She would count 11 heads at the morning roll, 11 coats on the pegs, 11 tin cups set round the stove at dinner. But at the end of the day there would be 12 slates in the stack, near enough as often as not. And one morning, coming in early to light the stove, she found the far desk under the window with its lid up, and a slate laid ready on it and a stub of chalk beside, as though someone had sat down to begin the day's work before any of the others had so much as crossed the moor. She had left that desk empty and its lid down the night before. She was as sure of that as she was of her own name. And there were the other small signs, the ones she noticed and did not let herself dwell on. A word she had left half-finished on the blackboard of an evening would be finished by the morning, in that same cramped old hand, correctly, patiently, the way a child completes a copy he has been set. A book she had left open on her high desk at the reading page would be turned back some mornings to an earlier and simpler page, to the very first reader, the one with the short words and the pictures, the page a child sits at who is only just beginning and cannot yet get past it. And the far desk under the window, however cold the rest of the room, was never quite as cold as it should have been. When she laid her hand on its lid last thing at night, out of a habit she came to dread, She felt in the old wood a faint, low, lingering warmth. The warmth of a seat lately sat in, of a place that has been kept ready, of a child who has only that moment got up and stepped away and means, with all his patient heart, to come back. She did not sleep well those days, and I don't suppose any of us would have. She kept coming back over her solitary supper to the 12th slate in the warm desk, and the reader turned back to its first page, and she found, as the short days drew in and the marking kept her later and later at the lamp, that she was not so much dreading the empty room of an evening as listening to it. That is how it works upon a careful soul, not by a terror, by a small kept place that will not let the mind alone. The dead hour of that school fell somewhere past 9 of a night, when the village lights were long out and the whole moor had gone as black and still as the bottom of a well, and it was very late on such a night, marking copybooks alone by the lamp with the stove ticking as it cooled, that she first looked up and saw him. He was at the far desk under the window, in the one seat that was always meant to stand empty. He was a boy of perhaps 9 or 10, though it was hard to be sure, in clothes that belonged to no year she knew, a rough jacket too big for him, and heavy boots, and a muffler wound about his throat as though against a cold that the warm room could not reach. His head was bent low over a slate, and he was working at it with the whole of himself, his lips moving, his chalk going slowly and stopping and going again, in the total, straining, private silence of a child who has set his heart on getting something right and cannot quite manage it. He did not look up at her. He did not seem to know that she was there at all, or to want anything of her, or to mean her the least harm in the world. He only bent over his slate at the back of her dark schoolroom and labored at his letters, patient and alone, as though the lesson had never ended and never would. She sat very still at her high desk with the pen gone dry in her hand and watched him, and I want you to understand that what she felt in that first long moment was not the fright you might expect. It was something worse and softer than fright. It was pity. For she had taught enough children to know at a glance the particular bowed shape of a child who is behind the others and knows it, who wants more than anything to keep up and cannot, and who works twice as hard as any of them for half as far. And here was such a child, working so, alone in the cold and the dark, at a lesson that no one had stayed to teach him. And a great part of her, the part that had made her a teacher in the first place, wanted only to go down the room to him and sit beside him and help him with the word. Her chair had scraped an inch upon the boards before she remembered the old man's face at the door. Do not set him a place. Do not call the roll for him. She stopped herself with her heart going hard, and she made herself gather her 11 marked books and close the register and take up her lamp and go round to her own side of the wall and leave him there. She looked back once from the door. He was still bent over his slate at the back, working, and he never lifted his head. In the morning, when she came in with her nerves wound tight, the far desk was empty and its lid was down, and on the top of the slate stack lay one worked over in that cramped old hand, a single short word attempted, over and over down the slate and rubbed out and begun again, and never quite finished. The same word each time. It was the plain small word for asterisk home. She stood a long while with that slate in her 2 hands, and then she did the only thing left to a woman in her position that was any use at all. She went to the cupboard where the old registers were kept, and she took them down, and she began to read. The registers of that little school went back a great many years, in the hands of teacher after teacher, the plain daily record of a moor parish that had schooled its children and lost them and schooled the next, the names called, the attendances marked, the hard winters when half the roll was kept home by snow. She read them backward from her own 11 toward the very first, looking for the thing she was half afraid she would find, and a long way down, in a winter 30-odd years before her own, she found it. There had been a boy on that roll, marked present week after week in a column of small farm names, a boy who had come the very longest walk of any of them, from a lonely holding away on the far side of the moor, 3 miles and more of open fell each way, in all the weathers there were. And the story of him, as she pieced it together from the register's own marks, and from what the old caretaker told her afterward when at last she asked him plainly, put into my own words and softened where it wants to be, was this. He had been a farm child, the youngest of a hard-pressed family, and by every account the school was the whole light of his life. He had no gift for letters. He was slower at his reading than any child in the room, and the walk cost him more than it cost any of them. And yet he came. Every day the weather let him, and a good many it didn't, and he stayed at his slate when the others were let out to play, and he worked at his reading with a patience that the teacher of that day set down more than once in her own margin notes as something that near broke her heart to watch. He wanted, more than any child she had taught, to learn to read. He was very nearly there. By that winter he could get out the short words one by one and was within a lesson or two the teacher had written of reading a whole page through by himself for the first time. And then the winter closed the sum for him. It came on to snow one morning in the deep of that winter, hard and sudden, the way it does on high ground, after the boy had already set out from his holding on the long walk in. What the register recorded, in a hand that faltered as it went, was that he never reached the school that day, and never reached his home again either. They found him the next morning when the snow eased, not so very far from the schoolyard wall. He had come almost the whole 3 miles through it, almost to the door, almost to the warm room and the lesson he loved, and the cold had taken him within sight of the light with his slate still held inside his coat against his chest. He had died a child, and a pupil, with his reading not finished and his last lesson not learned, and the short word for asterisk home still not quite got right upon his slate. And the school he had loved more than his life had buried him, and closed his column in the register with a ruled black line and gone on to the next name. But he had not gone on. That was the whole of it. He had not been able to. The last several pages of the newest old register were not attendances at all. They were notes, in the cramped, worried hand of the teacher who had come just before her, the one who had left in the middle of the year without notice, and they were a kind of warning laid down for whoever should come after. That teacher had seen him too, the child at the back, working his slate in the dead hour. And she had written down what she had learned, which was that he was no horror and meant no harm, but only came back to the desk he had loved to try, and try, and try again to finish the lesson that the snow had stopped, that he waited, with a patience that ought to break the heart, for someone to teach him the end of it. But she had written down, too, the thing the old caretaker had spoken at the door, and underlined it, that there had been a teacher once long before who had pitied the child as any of them would, and had kept the school lit and open for him past the dead hour, and had called his name into the empty room and set him his place and sat down to teach him, and who had never after been able to stop, who had kept the lamp burning night upon night for a pupil no one else could see, and could not be got to leave the room, and taught on to the dark and the cold long after the living children ceased to come, until they took her quietly away. The lesson, the note said, has no end if you keep it open in the dead hour. You will teach it forever, and so will he. Mark the 11 you have. Never call the roll for the 12th. Never keep the school past the dead hour. She closed the register. Outside the window the snow had begun again, soft and steady out of a black sky, settling on the moor exactly as it had settled 30 years before over a boy who wanted only to learn to read. And she understood now what worked at the desk under her window in the dead hour, and what it was patiently, endlessly asking of her. That was the worst of it and the truest. She understood him perfectly. The worst night of that winter came near the end of the term, and she knew it for a bad one from the moment the snow set in at dusk and did not stop, the same soft, relentless fall out of the same black sky, until the moor was gone under it, and the school stood alone in a hushed white world with no light and no living soul in it for a mile but herself. She had meant to go early to her own side of the wall that night. She did not. She sat on at her high desk with the marking done and put away and the lamp turned low, and she waited, though she would hardly have owned to it, for the dead hour and the child at the back. He came, as she had known he would. She looked up from the dark, and he was there in the far seat under the window, bent over his slate in his too big coat with the snow falling black past the glass behind him, working at the same short word he could never finish, his chalk going and stopping and going, patient past all bearing. And this time she did not gather her books to go. This time she let herself look at him for a long while, the loneliest and most patient child she had ever seen, laboring in the cold at the one thing he had wanted in all his short life and been robbed of by 3 miles of snow. And every gentle and generous instinct that had ever made her a teacher rose up in her at the sight of him and said that it would be the simplest thing in the world, and the kindest, to go to him at last. The register lay open on the desk beneath her hand, and she understood, sitting there, exactly what it was asking of her, and how little it would take. She had only to dip her pen and write his name at the foot of her 11 where it had been struck out 30 years before, and enroll him in her school as her own. She had only to call the roll for the 12th into the empty room and hear him answer at last. She had only to keep the lamp lit and the school open past the dead hour and go down the room and sit beside him and teach him the end of his lesson, and he would not be alone with it any longer, and neither, whispered the thing she would not name, would she. The pen was in her fingers. Her hand had moved to the head of the register before she knew it, to the ruled and waiting line. Down the room the boy bent over his slate and worked, and did not look up, and the snow came down and down past the black glass, and it would have been so small a thing, so warm and so reasonable a thing, one name written and one roll called in the dead hour, and the long cold loneliness of that room his and hers over at last. What stopped her in the end was not the old man's rule, and it was not fear. It was the last teacher's note, and the one thing in it she had not been able to put down, that a lesson kept open in the dead hour has no end. She understood with the pen an inch above the waiting line, what the child at the back did not, that to enroll him now and call his name into the dead hour to keep him, and teach him on and on with the door shut against the morning, would free neither of them. It would only be to sit down beside him at the back of that cold room and take up his endless winter with him, the lamp burning night upon night, the lesson never finished because she would never let it finish, 2 of them bent at the dark end of a schoolroom forever, waiting and never let out. That was not teaching a child. That was keeping one. And a child, she knew better than she knew anything, is not kept. A child is taught and finished and let go home. So she did not write his name to keep him. She did the other thing, the thing that had never once been done for him in all his 30 patient years. She taught him the end of his lesson so that he might be done with it. She rose, and she trimmed the lamp up bright, and she took the first reader from her high desk, the little one with the short words and the pictures, and she carried it down the long room through the falling dark, and she sat herself in the desk beside his the way she would have sat beside any struggling child of her 11. She did not touch him, and she did not call his name. She only opened the book to the page he had been turned back to so many mornings, the first page, the one he had never got past, and she taught it to him, quietly, patiently, in her own plain living voice, the way she had taught 100 children their letters. This word and then this, sounded out slow and kind, over and over, the way you teach the one who is behind and trying and so very nearly there. And beside her in the cold she heard, or felt, the small straining silence of him working and following her at last. And then she heard him read. She told me she could never afterward be sure whether it was in the ear or only in the heart, but that at the very last, on the very last try, the short words came haltingly, wonderingly, one and then the next and then the whole small line of them together, a child reading a page through by himself for the first time in his life, 30 years too late and exactly on time. And when he had read it, she did the rest of what a teacher does. She went back to her high desk, and she took up her pen, and she wrote his name into the register at last, in a fair clear hand, not struck out, not ruled off, but entered whole and finished as a pupil who has done his work and may be marked complete. And then she rang the little handbell on her desk, the plain bell that let the school out at the end of every day, and she said aloud into the room the thing she said to her 11 every evening of that winter, that the lesson was over, and the day was done, and it was time now to put the slates away and go home. She told the child at the back that he was finished, that he had read his page and learned his lesson and done all that was ever asked of him. That school was over, and he was a good boy, and he might go home now. And the desk let him go. She tells me the room did not grow cold or the lamp gutter or any fearful thing at all. It was gentler than that and sadder and better. There was only at the back of the room a kind of settling, the small stir of a child getting up from his seat at the end of the day, the sense of a coat gathered and a slate put by, of a long day's work at last set down. The warmth went out of the far desk under the window, quietly, the way warmth goes from a chair a child has risen from and will not sit in again. And when she made herself look down the room, the seat was empty, truly empty, in a way it had not been since the first night she came, its lid down, its slate clean, and the snow falling soft and ordinary past the black glass behind it over a moor that had, at last, nothing left out on it that was trying to come in. She kept the rest of her term at the moor school, and the far desk stayed empty, and no 12th slate ever came up in the stack again. But she did one more thing before the spring took her away, and I think it is the truest part of her. She walked out one still day to the corner of the churchyard, where the old man told her the boy was laid, and found the small worn stone with his name on it and nothing else, and she saw that it gave his years but never once called him what he had wanted more than his life to be. And so she had added to it, at her own cost, the 2 words the winter had cheated him of, that here lay a scholar of that parish, a boy who had learned to read. I have thought a good deal about why she carried this one so long before she gave it to me, and I think it is the tenderness at the heart of it, that the thing waiting in the cold at the back of that room was never a horror at all, but only a child who loved his school, and was stopped a lesson short of the door, and wanted nothing in all the patient years but for someone to stay behind and teach him the end. Because the dead are not always out there to frighten us. Sometimes they are only a small one at the back of the room, working a lesson no one stayed to finish, waiting with a patience that ought to break your heart for one living soul to sit down beside them and see them through to home. Not every quiet thing that keeps a place in the dark means you harm. Some of it is only a child who never got to go. That's where I'll leave her and leave you with the lesson finished, the desk let go empty, and a boy who read his page at last and was told, after 30 winters, that he might go home. If you'd sit up in the small hours for a story as quiet as this one, then do me a kindness before you go. Like it, share it, and subscribe, so the next tale finds its way to you when the dark comes down. And if the comments are open, tell me, was there ever a lesson, or a person, or a small kept place in your own life that never quite got the ending it was owed? Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning in the window if you'd rather, for anyone still out in the cold and trying to reach it. And if you should ever find yourself alone in some quiet room in the dead hour, and feel that you are not so alone as you thought, that something patient is keeping its place in the dark, and wanting only a little of your kindness, be careful and be wise, and heed the old rules as they are given to you. But do not be too quick to call it a monster. Some of the waiting dead are only children who never finished, and the bravest and kindest thing a living soul can do when the empty desk keeps its child is not to sit down and stay forever, but to teach the last lesson and hear them read and let them go home. Good night. There is a kind of order that has no business surviving. A great house may be shut and a family scattered, and the grounds they loved may go back, season upon season, to bramble and thorn and the slow patience of the wild. And yet, somewhere in the heart of all that gentle ruin, one small square of earth may stay turned, and weeded, and kept, as though the hands that tended it had never heard that the world had moved on. On the far edge of a great cold estate one winter, a new man came upon such a place behind a high wall, and he learned, before that winter was out, that the hands still kept it, that they had never stopped, and that in the dead hour they were still out there among the frozen beds by the light of a lantern, keeping a promise that death itself had not been permitted to end. "Good evening. Come in out of the cold and let me shut the door on it and draw your chair up near the fire, for this is a story that keeps to the deep of winter and is best told with the dark pressed close against the glass. I am the one who tells these tales. I gather the ones that people carry quietly for the whole of their lives, and I sit with each until it settles into something I can hand across to you. Tonight's story came to me from a man who spent a single winter as the groundskeeper of a great emptied estate away in the north, and who, for all the long life he lived afterward, never let one small garden of his own go untended a single day. So settle back into the warmth, and let me tell you about a shut house, a wild garden, and an old man and his wife who would not put down their tools. The man at the heart of it was not young, and not old. He had been a gardener on other people's land the whole of his days, good with his hands and easy with his own silence, and when the winter came that this story keeps, he was out of a place and glad of anything. So when word reached him that a great estate on the moor's edge wanted a single man to keep its grounds through the cold months, no household, no family in residence, only the land to be watched over until the lawyers settled what was to become of it, he took the post before he had rightly asked himself why such a place should stand empty at all. He would come to understand out there that there is a solitude that is only the absence of the living, and then there is a solitude that is very full indeed, and only waiting for the dark to show you so. The estate was a vast one, and had been a grand one, and was neither any longer. The great house stood shuttered and sheeted at the head of a long, weed-cracked drive, its chimneys cold and its 100 windows blind, its family, an old and dwindling line, gone down at last to the final few, dead or scattered to cities far off, so that the whole place had passed into the gray keeping of lawyers and waited, year by year, for a decision that never came. The gardens that had once been the pride of the county had gone back to the wild, the yew walks grown shaggy, the great lawns gone to rough meadow, the glass houses standing with their panes fallen in. It was a beautiful desolation, and it did not trouble him. There was one exception, and he learned of it on his first evening from the steward, an elderly, careful man who did not stay past dusk if he could help it. Before he took up his hat to go, the steward stopped the new man by the door and told him the one thing that was written in no agreement and set down in no book. Put into my own words, it was this: let the rest of the grounds go as they please. No one living will ever walk them again. But away at the far end of the east grounds, beyond the wild yews, there is an old walled garden, a kitchen garden of the old sort, high brick on every side and a single door in the wall, and that one, whatever else you let go, you are to keep. Turn its soil when the frost allows. Tend the little shrine at its heart and keep the well beside it clear. And then the steward had looked at him a moment longer in the failing light, and added the rest of it lower, as a man says a thing he would rather not, that if ever the new man should find himself out at the far end in the dead hour, and should see a light moving in the walled garden, and an old man and his wife at work there among the beds by lantern light, he was to do 3 things and no more. He was not to speak to them. He was not to stop them, nor go in among them, nor lend a hand at their work. And above all, he was to leave the garden and the shrine and the thing they kept exactly as he found it, for they had kept a promise there longer than any living memory, and it was not his to break. He took the steward's words for what they plainly sounded like, the sort of tale that grows over an old empty place the way ivy grows over its walls, handed from one caretaker to the next because a lonely post wants peopling somehow, even with a fear. He thanked the man, and watched the trap go rattling away down the long drive, and then he was alone with the shut house, and the great cold quiet of the estate settling round him like water closing over a stone. That first night he slept well enough, and in the morning he walked the near grounds in the thin winter light and thought it as lovely and harmless a ruin as a man could wish to be left alone in. That much was still true. It would not stay true for long. He did not go out to the walled garden at once, and that tells you the kind of man he was. He was not one to go hunting after a fear handed to him. He was more inclined to let a place tell him its business in its own time. But a rule given is a thing that pulls at a man, and a garden he had been charged to tend was a duty as much as a mystery. And on the fourth day, with a clear cold noon over the estate and a spade on his shoulder, he went down the long east grounds to see the thing he had been set to keep. The way to it was half lost. The old path had gone under grass and bramble, and the yews had closed over it into a dark green tunnel that he had to push his way through, so that when he came out into the open and saw the wall, it was with the particular surprise of a thing found where the land had done its best to hide it. It was a high garden wall of old rose-red brick, mellowed and lichened with its centuries, with a single stout door of weathered oak set into the near side. And the strangeness of it reached him before he had so much as touched the door, because the wall, unlike every other built thing on that estate, was sound. The coping was whole, the brick pointed and firm. Where all else was falling, this one high square stood as trim as though the mason had gone home from it the week before. He lifted the latch and pushed the heavy door and went in, and what he found inside stopped him on the threshold with the breath gone still in his chest. For the wild ended at that wall as though a line had been drawn. Inside was a garden, a true, worked living garden, kept to a pitch of order he had not seen on the whole ruined estate and would scarcely have believed of a place with any family left to pay for it, let alone none. The long beds were dug and turned and dark, edged straight as a rule, dressed against the frost. The espaliered fruit trees were pruned hard and neat along the warm south wall, the gravel walks raked. And down at the heart of it, where the four walks met, there stood a low-weathered shrine, an old worn niche of a thing, hardly more than a carved stone hood over a small kept space, with a little stone well beside it, and the ground all about it was the most tended of all, swept and weeded to the last blade, with a small clay pot of something green and living set before it, fresh, as though it had been placed there that very morning by a hand that meant to come back and place another tomorrow. He walked the garden slowly, and the more he saw of it the less sense it made. This was not the leavings of some care taken years ago and long abandoned. This was daily work, a garden tended, patiently and skillfully, and without a day's lapse, by someone who knew it as a man knows the back of his own hand, and the estate had not employed a gardener in longer than anyone in the town could rightly say. He told himself the sensible things, an old villager keeping it for love, the steward paying someone quietly, and none of it quite fitted, because there was no track worn to that far door but the one he had just broken himself, and the fresh green in the pot before the shrine had been set there by a hand that had left no footprint at all on the raked and frosted gravel. He did the work he had come to do, because the doing of it steadied him, and then went back up through the yews as the light failed, and told himself he would think no more of it. But that night, very late, some restlessness he could not name took him to the cottage window that looked away east over the black grounds. And down there, across the whole dark width of the sleeping estate, where he knew there stood only a walled garden with no soul in it for a mile, a small warm light was moving. It went slowly and low and steadily, back and forth and along, in the patient, unhurried way of a lantern carried by someone at work among beds in the dark. It never left the bounds of the walls, and near 2 in the morning, at the low still turn of the night, it dimmed and sank and went out, the way a lantern goes out that has been set down at last by someone kneeling to their work. He did not sleep much after that, and I don't suppose any of us would have. He lay in the dark of the cottage and told himself all the things the daylight would surely explain: a poacher, a lost soul from the village, a trick of his own tired eyes on the black glass, and by morning he had half persuaded himself, in the way a man does who wants very much to be persuaded. But the walled garden had a hold on him now that would not let go, and it was not, he told me, a hold of fear so much as of a kind of wondering tenderness, for there is nothing quite so gentle to look upon as a thing kept faithfully, and nothing that pulls so hard at a decent man's heart as the wish to know who keeps it, and why. So he went back day after day, and each night the light came back to the walls. At last, on a still and bitter night deep in that winter, he wrapped himself against the cold and went down through the black yews to the far wall in the dead hour, to see for himself who worked the garden in the dark. The door in the wall stood a little ajar, a soft glow leaking out at its edge, and he came up to it quietly over the frozen grass and looked in through the gap. And there, in the heart of the walled garden, in the pool of a single warm lantern set down upon the gravel, were an old man and his wife, at their work among the winter beds. They were an old country couple of the plain and weathered kind he had known the whole of his life, dressed in the fashion of a good many years past, the man in a rough coat and an old soft hat, the woman in a long dark dress and shawl, a wide bonnet pushed back from her gray head. The old man was down on one knee at the edge of a bed with a trowel in his hand, firming something into the cold soil with the slow, sure care of a lifetime's practice, and the old woman knelt at the little shrine at the crossing of the walks, drawing a cloth over the worn stone, setting all to rights with the tenderness of a mother at a child's bed. They did not speak, the wordless understanding of two people who have worked side by side so long they have no more need of speech than the two hands of one body. And over the whole of it lay a peace so deep that the man at the door forgot, for a while, to be afraid. There was nothing dreadful in that garden. There was only a lantern in the cold, and two old people at their patient work, and the great tender quiet of a labor that had gone on so long it had worn itself smooth as a stone in a stream. He watched them a long time, and what rose in him, he told me, was not the terror you would expect but something worse to bear, because it was so near to love. It was pity and longing, and the ache a lonely man feels at the window of a lit and peopled room. For here were two souls who had one another, and a work they loved, out in all that dark and empty ruin. And here was he alone, watching them from the cold on the wrong side of a door. And a great part of him, the part that had made him a gardener in the first place, that cannot pass a struggling row without stooping to it, wanted nothing so much as to go in, and kneel down in the lantern light beside them and take up a trowel and help. His hand was on the door and the cold latch was rising under his thumb before the steward's face came back to him in the dark. Do not speak to them. Do not go in among them. Do not lend a hand at their work. He stopped himself, with his heart going hard and slow, and stepped back into the deeper dark of the wall. And as he did, the old woman at the shrine lifted her head not sharply, not in alarm, but slowly, and turned her face toward the door where he stood, as a person turns who has felt a draught or sensed, without quite hearing it, that someone kind is near. He could not see her face clearly, and he was glad of it, glad because what he could see was not fearsome in the least, but only old and patient and unbearably gentle, and he knew that if she had looked full at him he could not have kept himself from answering it. He drew back into the yews and went up to the cottage with his blood loud in his ears, and behind him the lantern went on, low and steady, until the turn of the night. In the morning he made himself go down again in the clean, cold daylight. The garden was as trim and empty as ever, but at the little shrine, where the old woman had knelt in the night, the green pot had been freshened and the stones swept, and there was no footprint on the frost, and no wax fallen from any lantern, and no sign in all that ordered ground that a living soul had been there since the world began. And then he did the only thing left to a man in his position that was any use at all. He went up to the great shut house, let himself into the cold estate office where the lawyer's papers were kept, and he began to read. The estate had kept its books in a long, unbroken run of ledgers and wage lists, and he sat in the cold office over them for the better part of 2 days, turning the stiff fox pages by lamplight. And near the middle of that long run of years, in the wage lists of a season some 50 winters gone, he found the first of it, a line for a gardener and his wife, taken onto the estate together, kept on the books year upon year in the same 2 names, right down to a winter where the 2 names stopped in a single season together, and were ruled off with one quiet line and never entered again. And tucked among the ledgers, kept apart in a drawer as a thing valued, he found the rest of it, A garden diary, an old worn book in a plain country hand, the daily record of the walled garden kept faithfully across the whole of those 50 years by the very hand that had kept the garden itself. He read it through, and the story it told him pieced out from the diary's own patient entries, and from what the steward, pressed at last, would tell him, put into my own words and softened where it wants to be, was this. Long ago, in the days when the great house was full, and the family still walked its own gardens, the old couple had come to that country with nothing at all. They had been wanderers, turned off from somewhere and turned away everywhere, come to the estate gate one hard winter with no more claim on the place than any beggar has on any door. And they would have been sent on their way, as such folk always were, but for a child. For the family had a daughter then, a little girl, the youngest and last of that old line, and she had been at the gate when the ragged couple came to it. And she had taken it into her small, stubborn heart that they should not be turned away into the cold, and she had begged her father for them until the thing was done. And so the old couple were taken in, and given the cottage and an honest wage and a place in the world when they had none, all through the pity of one small girl who could not bear to see two strangers sent to die in the snow. They never forgot it. A kindness like that, done to those who have nothing, is not a thing the grateful ever set down. The garden was the child's own. The walled garden had been given over to her, in the way such families would give a child a patch to call her kingdom, and it was there she played out the whole of her childhood and loved best in all the estate. And the little stone shrine at its heart was her own small holy place, a worn niche where she kept her treasures and said her child's prayers. And the old couple, in their gratitude, made that garden their life's whole care. They kept it for her as she grew and made it the finest thing on the estate. They loved her as their own. They had no children, and she had saved their lives at a gate one winter, and so they poured the whole of their long devotion into the one thing that was hers. And then the young woman was lost. She went away from the estate, as the young of such families did away to a city or across the sea. The diary is not clear, and I think the old man could hardly bear to write it plainly. And there, far from home, in a bad winter of some spreading sickness, she took ill and died, a great deal too young. She was buried where she fell, among strangers, under no stone that anyone who loved her ever saw. And the family meant, as families always mean, to bring her home to lie in the garden she had loved. But the money was failing, the line was dwindling, the years went by, and it was never done. She lay far off in a stranger's ground, unmarked and unvisited, and her own small garden and her own small shrine stood waiting for her at the heart of the walled square, and she never came. The old couple would not have it. The last entries in the diary, in a hand grown shaky and old but never once faltering, set it down plain, that they would keep her garden and keep her shrine, and hold it all ready and perfect against the day she was brought home to it at last, for as long as ever they lived. And they kept that word to the very end, the two names ruled off together in the wage book, an old man and his wife gone within a season of each other, worn out in the service of a promise. But the promise was not kept for all their keeping of it. The one thing they had vowed, to have their girl home, and laid to rest in her own ground beneath her own shrine, was never in their power while they lived, for they were only servants, with no say over where the dead of the family should lie. They tended an empty shrine for 50 years, waiting for a homecoming that no one ever arranged, and death, when it came, did not release them from it. A promise like that, made by the grateful to the one who saved them, and left undone through no fault of their own, is a debt that does not let its debtors rest. And so they had gone on keeping the garden, night after night, waiting still, for their girl to be brought home so that they might lay her down at last and be done. He closed the book. Outside the office window the early dark had come down over the ruined grounds, and away at the far end of the east, he knew the lantern had come again to the walled garden, and that the two of them were at their patient work, keeping ready a place for someone who had been 50 years in coming. And he understood now what it was they kept, and what they waited for, and what it would take to let them rest. That was the worst of it and the truest. He understood them perfectly. The worst night of that winter came a little before its end, and he knew it for a bad one from the moment the dark shut down, for it came with a still, hard, breathless frost. The kind of night when the whole world seems to hold its breath, and the stars burn close and cold. He had meant to keep to his cottage and his fire, and let the far garden keep its own long watch without him. He did not. Something in the knowing of it now, in the whole sad weight of what he had read, drew him down through the black frozen yews to the wall in the dead hour, and he came to the door, and it stood ajar with its soft glow leaking out, and he looked in. They were there, as he had known they would be, the old man and his wife in the pool of the lantern. But this night was different, and he felt it the instant he looked in, for this night they were not merely tending. The old woman knelt at the shrine with her worn hands folded and her gray head bowed, and the old man stood beside her with his hat off against his chest, and the two of them were still, and waiting, turned toward the empty kept place at the heart of the garden with a look of such patient, aching, unbearable hope that it went into him like the cold itself. They were waiting for their girl. They had kept the place ready one more night, as they had kept it for 50 years of nights, and they waited with their whole faithful hearts for her to be brought home to it at last. And there was no one to bring her, and there never had been. And that was when the pull came on him in its full strength. For as he stood there at the door, aching with the whole sorrow of it, the thought rose up in him quiet and warm and terribly reasonable, that he could go in, that he could lift the latch and cross the frosted gravel into the lantern light, and kneel down there beside the two faithful old souls, and take up a trowel, and stay, and never be alone and cold and shut out on the wrong side of a door again. That here was a work worth the giving of a life to, and here were two who would take him in, as the family had once taken them in, and he would have a place, and a purpose, and company in the long dark. He had only to go in, and kneel, and take up the trowel, and be one of them, and the loneliness of his whole hard life would be over. His hand was on the latch. He does not think he ever told it to be. He said the pull of that warm-lit place after the cold of his whole life was so strong and so reasonable and so nearly kind that some part of him leaned toward it the way a frozen man leans toward a fire, past all thought of what the fire will cost him. The latch was rising under his thumb. In the lantern light the two old people knelt and waited, patient past all bearing. And he came within the space of a breath, within the small last weight of a thumb on a cold iron latch, of lifting it, and going in, and kneeling down among them, and never coming out of that garden again. What stopped him in the end was not the steward's rule, and it was not fear. It was the diary, and the one thing in it he had not been able to put down, that the old couple were kept in that garden not by love of the work, nor even by love of their girl, but by a promise left undone, and that the doing of it was the only thing that could set them free. He understood, with his thumb on the rising latch, what the two of them could not, that to go in now, and kneel and take up the trowel beside them, would not end their waiting nor his own. It would only add himself to it, three of them now instead of two, kneeling in the cold at a ready and empty shrine, waiting for a homecoming that no waiting could ever bring about. For the one thing the old couple needed was not another pair of faithful hands to tend the beds. It was for someone to bring their girl home. And that, he saw, was a thing that he could do, not by kneeling and not by staying, but by going back into the world of the living, and doing with his living hands the one plain, hard, human thing that 50 years of faithful ghosts had never been able to do for want of the standing to do it. So he took his hand from the latch, and turned his back on the two old souls at their endless work, which was the hardest thing he ever did. And he went up through the black yews to the cottage, and by morning he knew what he must do. It took him the rest of that winter, and a good part of his own small savings, and he never once grudged it. From the estate books in the old diary, he had the name of the far city where she had died, and he wrote letters, and waited on answers and wrote again, patient and stubborn as an old gardener at a hard row, until at the last, in a neglected corner of a great city cemetery, under no stone at all, he found where their girl had lain unvisited for 50 years. And then he did the thing that all the love of two faithful ghosts had never had the power to do. With the leave of the last scattered few of the family, and at the cost of very nearly all he had her brought home, lifted at last from her stranger's ground, carried the long way north to the estate that had been hers, and laid to rest where she had always belonged, in the heart of the walled garden, beneath her own small shrine, in the one square of loving earth that had waited 50 years for her coming. And over her he set a plain good stone, and cut into it her name and her years, and beneath them the only words he could think of that were true, that here at last lay the daughter of that house, brought home, long waited for and dearly kept. And the garden let them go. The night after the girl was laid in her own ground beneath her own shrine, he went down in the dead hour to the wall and looked in through the door, and the lantern light was there in the garden still, but it was not at its work. The old man and his wife stood together in the pool of the lantern at the foot of the new stone, the old man with his hat in his hand and the old woman's arm through his, looking down at the homecoming they had kept ready for 50 faithful years, come at last. And he told me there was nothing dreadful in it, and nothing cold, that it was gentler than that, and gladder and better than he had words for. For as he watched, the two old souls seemed to loose their long hold on the place, the way a hand at the end of a good day's work loosens at last from the tool it has gripped since dawn. And the lantern light did not gutter or die so much as it simply eased and let go, and where the two of them had stood, there was only the quiet garden, and the new stone, and the frost coming down soft and ordinary over a square of earth that had, at last, nothing left in it that waited. He never saw the light again. He tended the walled garden to the end of his post, and when the spring was over he went away from that estate and did not come back. But he kept a garden of his own every year of the long life he lived after, and never let it go a day untended, and when he was very old he told me why. He said that of all he had learned there, the one thing he could never set down was the sight of the two of them at the last, standing over the stone with the waiting finally gone out of them. Two people given a home when they had nothing, who had spent 50 years, and then their deaths, and then 50 years more, trying to pay it back, and were not allowed to rest until the debt of one great kindness was discharged in full, because the dead are not always out there to frighten us. Sometimes they are only two grateful old people at their patient work in the cold, keeping a promise the living let fall, and waiting with a faithfulness that ought to shame us all for one kind soul to come and help them keep it. That's where I'll leave them and leave you with the garden quiet, the shrine tended, and a girl brought home at last to the one square of earth that never stopped waiting for her. If you'd sit up in the small hours for a story as tender as this one, then do me a kindness before you go. Like it, share it, and subscribe, so the next tale finds its way to you when the dark comes down. And if the comments are open, tell me, was there ever a promise, or a debt of kindness, or a thing left undone by someone you loved, that you would go a long cold way to see kept at last? Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning in the window if you'd rather, for anyone still out in the dark and faithfully at their work. And if you should ever come, in some wild and forgotten place, upon one small square of earth kept perfect against all reason, a garden, or a grave, or a shrine, tended by someone who ought long ago to have laid their tools down, then be gentle, and heed the old rules as they are given to you. But do not be too quick to call it a haunting. Some of the waiting dead are only the faithful, kept from their rest by a promise they could not finish. And the kindest thing a living soul can do when the walled garden keeps its keepers is not to kneel and stay forever, but to find the one undone thing and do it for them, and let them lay their tools down and go home. Good night.